He threw her out in the rain. That was the part Elena Marlowe kept turning over in her mind. Even weeks later, not the words Adrian used, not the cold precision of his voice when he told her the marriage was finished, but the fact that he hadn't even waited for the storm to pass. He had opened the front door himself, held it open like a butler, dismissing a guest who had overstayed, and stood there watching, while she walked out into the dark, with rain already soaking through her coat. One hand pressed flat against her stomach without her even realizing she was doing it. She hadn't argued, hadn't begged, hadn't told him what she knew. She had simply reached up, pulled the wedding ring from her finger and placed it, somewhere he would never think to look, and then she disappeared. What Adrian Voss didn't know, what would take him months to understand, was that Elena hadn't left because she was guilty. She left because someone inside his own organization had already decided that she had to die. If you've ever loved someone who refused to believe you, who chose a lie over the person standing right in front of them, stay with this story. Because what happened to Elena Marlowe is the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself. It comes quietly, dressed as loyalty, wearing the face of someone you trust. We're glad you're here. If this story hits you somewhere real, please subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from, because we genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the night everything broke. The Blackridge estate had a particular silence on stormy nights that Adrian Voss had learned to read the way sailors read water. When the thunder came from the east, the sound bounced off the stone exterior and filled the ground floor with a low, resonant hum. The old house absorbed noise like that, swallowed it, held it, turned it into something that pressed against the walls crimsonly from the inside. He was at his desk when he heard her footsteps on the stairs. Not running, not slow either. That careful middle pace Elena used when she was controlling herself, when she had decided that whatever she was feeling was not going to come out on her face if she could help it. He didn't look up. "I need you to listen to me." Her voice was steady enough that most people wouldn't have caught at the small tightness just under the words, the way her breath landed a half-second off from where it should have been. "Adrian, I need 5 minutes. I'm busy. I know you're busy. I'm asking for 5 minutes." He set down the pen, looked at her then. She was standing in the doorway of his study, in a gray pullover and bare feet, her dark hair still slightly damp from an earlier shower, and she had both hands clasped in front of her at her waist, in the way she did when she was working hard not to wring them. She looked exhausted. She had looked exhausted for weeks, and he had told himself it was the pregnancy, told himself her body was doing the thing it needed to do, told himself the circles under her eyes and the way she startled at small sounds were nothing he needed to investigate further. He had been telling himself a lot of things. "Close the door," he said. Did. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being asked, which she almost never did, and for a moment she just looked at him the way someone looks at a building they're not sure they can trust to hold weight. "Someone came to see me today," she said. "Who? I don't know his name." "He came to the house while you were at the Meridian meeting. Marcus let him through, said you'd approved a guest list for the afternoon." She paused. "Your name was apparently on the authorization." Something moved behind Adrian's eyes, but he didn't let it reach his face. What did he want? He wanted to show me something. Elena reached into the front pocket of her pullover and withdrew a folded sheet of paper, slightly creased at the edges from being held too many times. She placed it on the desk between them and didn't push it toward him. Just left it there. He said you had already seen it. He said you'd been sitting on it for 3 weeks. Adrian looked at the paper. He didn't touch it. "He said if I cared about this family," Elena continued, "I would leave quietly before you decided to handle it yourself." The silence that followed was the kind that has mass to it, the kind that takes up physical space in a room and makes the air harder to breathe. "Open it," she said quietly. He did. It was a photograph. Grainy, taken at distance, shot through what looked like a restaurant window from the street. The image showed a table, 2 people. One of them was a man Adrian recognized immediately, Caruso Trent, the man who had ordered the deaths of 3 of Adrian's couriers 18 months ago, who had tried twice to bribe Adrian's port contacts, who represented everything Adrian had spent a decade building walls against. The second person at the table was Elena. Adrian didn't say anything for a long time. "That's not what it looks like," she said. Her voice had changed quieter now, more careful. The way a person speaks when they already know that whatever they say next is going to be used against them. No. He set the photograph down on the desk face up, evenly, like he was filing a document. Tell me what it looks like. It looks like I was meeting with Caruso Trent. I know how it looks, were you? I was there. In that restaurant. Yes. She leaned forward slightly. But Adrian, I need you to hear me. That meeting, I didn't arrange it. He contacted me through a number I didn't recognize. He told me he had information about the organization that you needed to know. He said people close to you were preparing to move against you. He said if I didn't come, the window to stop it would close. And you went, alone. I went because I thought I could get information that would protect you. Without telling me. I tried to tell you. I tried 3 separate times that week, and you were in closed sessions with Victor every single time. And when I asked Marcus to pass a message, you told me through Marcus that it could wait. Something crossed her face, not anger, not quite, but the precursor to it, the tight-jawed predecessor. I made a bad call. I should have pushed harder. I know that. Adrian stood up from behind the desk. He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing about Adrian Voss, that the people who worked for him understood and feared he didn't need to raise his voice. His stillness was its own kind of violence. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, watching the rain move across the grounds in dark curtains, and he was quiet for so long that Elena's breathing shifted. What did Trent tell you? He finally said. He told me someone in your inner circle had been feeding information to outside buyers for 14 months. He gave me a name. She hesitated. He gave me Victor Dane's name. Adrian turned around. His face was wrong. That was the only way Elena could have described it afterward. His face was wrong in a way she had never seen before. Not in 4 years of marriage. Not through all the nights she had watched him. Carry things he would never talk about. Not through any of it. He looked at her like she had just told him the floor was made of water. Victor, he said flatly. I know how it sounds. Trent told you Victor is a traitor. He showed me documents. Partial records transfer logs. Coded correspondence. They were rough copies. Not complete, but they were consistent with each other. The dates, the amounts, the routing structure, it matched the kind of internal architecture only someone at Victor's level would know. Trent is my enemy, Elena. I know that. He has spent 4 years trying to dismantle what I've built. He has lied to my contacts, bribed my people, tried to reframe my organization as a target in front of the federal task force. He is not a man who does things out of concern for my welfare. He is a man who manipulates. His voice, still controlled, had taken on an edge that she recognized. The edge that came just before a decision was made. And you sat across a table from him and let him tell you my most trusted lieutenant is a traitor. And you believed him. I didn't say I believed him. I said he showed me evidence. Evidence he constructed. Elena kept copies. Her voice was firm, not loud. Firm. Everything he showed me I photographed on my phone before I left. I have been cross-referencing those records for 3 weeks against the public financial disclosures from the Meridian holding structure. The numbers don't lie, Adrian. They're buried, but they're there. She stood up. I was going to bring it to you when I had enough to be certain. I was trying to protect you from acting on incomplete information, the way you always do, the way you're doing right now. The silence came back. Heavier this time. You've been investigating Victor, Adrian said slowly, on your own, for 3 weeks, using documents provided by Caruso Trent without telling me. Yes. He walked past her, not toward her, past her toward the door, and he opened it, not the office door, but the study door that opened to the hall, and he stood there holding it open. Rain was audible now, even from inside, beating at the eastern windows, filling the hall with a low percussion. Get out of this house, he said. Elena didn't move immediately. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm 3 months pregnant, she said. Not as a plea, as a statement of fact, I know, Adrian. I want you out of this house tonight. I'll have arrangements made. Money will not be an issue, but I want you gone before morning. Her face did something complicated. Not tears. Elena didn't cry easily, and she would not cry in front of him, not now. It was something quieter and more damaging than tears. The look someone who had calculated a possibility and now discovered it had come true. She reached up, without theatrics, without ceremony, and pulled her wedding ring from her finger. She didn't put it on his desk. She didn't drop it. She walked to the tall wooden bookcase along the eastern wall, reached to the third shelf and picked up the old music box that had sat there since, before their marriage, a thing she had brought to this house from her own childhood: carved rosewood, tarnished brass fittings, a small latch on the underside that most people never noticed. She opened it, placed the ring inside a hollow compartment in the base, and set the box back on the shelf in exactly the same position. And she walked past him, out the door into the rain-soaked night. Adrian stood at the open door and watched her go. He told himself it was the right decision. He told himself Trent had worked her, had found the soft point in their marriage, and pressed on it with professional precision, had used her pregnancy and her worry for him as leverage to plant a story that would fracture Adrian's most important relationship from the inside. He told himself she had let it happen. He stood there until her car was gone. Then he closed the door, walked back to his desk, picked up the photograph of Elena and Caruso Trent, and locked it in the bottom drawer. He did not open that drawer again for 4 months. What Adrian did not know, what he had no way of knowing that night, because he had chosen certainty over listening, was that Elena had not gone to a hotel. She had not called her sister or reached out to old friends, or found herself a quiet apartment somewhere on the safer side of the city. She had gone to a single-room rental above a dry cleaning shop on Farwell Street, cash only, no name on the register, paid for by a prepaid card she had set up 2 weeks earlier. She had 2 bags with her. She had a prepaid phone. She had printed copies of 46 pages of financial records, tucked inside a waterproof folder inside the lining of her second bag. And she had a name written in pencil on the inside cover of a small notebook she kept pressed against her body: Marcus Webb. Not Victor Dane, not Caruso Trent, not the names she had spoken out loud in that study. The name she hadn't said yet, the one she needed more time to prove. She needed to move carefully. Because whoever Marcus Webb was working, for whoever had authorized a stranger to walk into the Blackridge estate and show Elena a manufactured photograph designed to look like evidence of her guilt, that person had also made sure. The authorization memo carried Adrian's name on it, which meant either Adrian knew and had sent the man himself, or someone had learned to forge Adrian's name so cleanly that his own head of household security had waved a stranger through the front door without question. Elena sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room on Farwell Street and listened to the rain. She placed both hands flat on her stomach and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way her doctor had shown her. Slow, even. She had 8 months at most to figure out which one it was. She opened the notebook and started writing. The weeks that followed were the kind that don't announce themselves as the worst of your life while they're happening. They came in looking like ordinary time: cold mornings, bad coffee, the particular loneliness of eating takeout from a paper bag in a room where the radiator made a sound like a dying animal every hour on the hour. Elena learned the rhythm of Farwell Street the way she had once learned the rhythm of the Blackridge estate, by sitting still and listening until the pattern revealed itself. The dry cleaning shop owner below her was named Mr. Hatch, and he worked Tuesdays through Saturdays, and he had a granddaughter who came on Thursday afternoons and laughed too loud at things he said, and he never came upstairs, and he had never asked Elena her name. She was grateful for all of it. She worked at the small table by the window. She had a second-hand laptop paid for in cash. She had a printer that cost $40 at a discount electronics shop 3 blocks away. She had the 46 pages of Caruso Trent's records, which she had now read so many times that she could reconstruct the structure from memory, the shell company architecture, the routing pattern, the timing intervals that suggested regular scheduled transfers rather than ad hoc payments, which pointed to a standing arrangement, not a crisis response. And she had the symbol. It had come to her on the 3rd week. Almost by accident, she had been cross-indexing the shell company registrations against publicly available business license records when she found it, embedded in the fine print of a 3rd-tier holding company. A small geometric mark, 2 overlapping triangles inside a circle, used as an authentication seal on notarized documents. She had seen it before, not in financial records, in a photograph. A photograph Adrian kept in the bottom left drawer of his desk at the estate, one she had seen only once, years ago, when she had reached into that drawer looking for a pen, and pulled it out by accident, an old image of a man she had never met, standing in front of what looked like a shipping yard, and on the collar of his coat, barely visible, the same mark. She hadn't known then what it meant. She hadn't given it more than a moment's attention. Now she pressed her fingertip against the printed page and stared at the symbol for a long time. She wrote 3 words in her notebook: find the collar. Adrian Voss did not fall apart after Elena left. He would have been disgusted by the idea. He threw himself into the organization the way he always had when personal life became inconvenient, with complete and brutal focus, the kind that leaves no room for second thoughts because it fills every available minute with work that has to be done now. Decisions that require attention this morning. Problems that do not wait for grief to run its course. Victor Dane was at his right hand through all of it, the way he had been for 11 years. Victor was 44, broad through the shoulders, had a scar along his left jaw from something he had never explained, and had the particular quality of competence that expresses itself not through confidence, but through an absence of uncertainty. He never seemed to be deciding. He always seemed to have already decided, and to be waiting patiently for the world to catch up. Adrian trusted him the way you trust the ground under your feet without thinking about it, which is the most dangerous way to trust anything. "You're sleeping worse," Victor said, at the end of one of their late meetings, about 6 weeks after Elena's departure. He said it the way he said most things without inflection, as an observation, not a question. "I'm fine." Didn't say you weren't fine. Said you're sleeping worse. Adrian looked up from the document spread across the table. Victor was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, watching Adrian with that level, patient attention that had always made Adrian feel like Victor was perpetually a step ahead of whatever room they were in. "She called," Adrian said after a moment. "When?" 2 weeks ago. Left a message with the service. Said she wanted to talk. Said it was important." He paused. "I didn't call back." Victor nodded slowly. "You think it's leverage? I think she's working with Trent. I think the conversation she wants to have is designed to give Trent's operation better access to whatever she managed to pull from the estate before she left." He said it flatly, as a conclusion. The kind of conclusion that has been so thoroughly examined it no longer requires defense. Victor looked at him for a moment. Something crossed his face, not doubt exactly, but a flicker of something that was too brief to read. "If that's what you think," Victor said, "then you're right not to call back." "I know. Just wanted to make sure you'd thought it through." "I have." Victor nodded again and gathered his papers, and that was the end of it. Adrian told himself he felt settled about it, and the fact that he had to tell himself said more than he would have admitted. It was Marcus Webb who first started to move. Elena watched it happen from a distance she had worked very hard to establish and maintain. She had spent 3 months building a picture of Marcus Webb that had nothing to do with what she had suspected when she first wrote his name in her notebook. What she had suspected was embezzlement, a lower-level graft, the kind of arrangement that grows out of resentment and access. What she found instead was something with a shape she recognized from the Trent documents. Marcus Webb had a brother-in-law named Daniel Cho, who worked in municipal permitting. Daniel Cho had signed off on 17 accelerated permits for construction projects in the Harbor District over the past 2 years. 7 of those projects were owned, through 3 layers of shell structures, by a holding company called Sarant Capital. Sarant Capital had been incorporated by a law firm that had also incorporated 2 of the shell entities in Caruso Trent's documents. Elena stared at the diagram she had drawn across 4 sheets of paper taped together on the wall beside the window, and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. This wasn't Victor Dane. This was never Victor Dane. Victor had been the false trail, the name in Trent's documents, the figure positioned carefully in the visible frame so that anyone investigating would focus there and look nowhere else. It was elegant. It was the kind of plan that required intimate knowledge of Adrian's organization, his trust patterns, his blind spots. It required knowing that Adrian trusted Victor absolutely, and that an accusation against Victor from an outside source would read, to Adrian, as an obvious fabrication. Which meant that whoever built this plan knew Adrian well enough to predict exactly how he would respond to Azena's conversation in that study. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She thought about the authorization memo, the one that had carried Adrian's name, the one that had allowed a stranger into the estate to show her a photograph designed to look like proof of her guilt. She thought about who, in the Blackridge estate, had access to Adrian's signature and the authority to issue security clearances. She thought about how long she had been inside this investigation, and how many of the conclusions she had reached had been conclusions she had been guided toward. She opened her notebook and crossed out Marcus Webb's name. She wrote, underneath it, 2 words, Victor's clean. Then she drew a circle around the word guided, and she started again. The break came not from a document, or a financial record, or a careful cross-reference. It came from Mr. Hatch's granddaughter. Elena had been careful the way pregnancy teaches you to be, constantly aware of your own body's limits, constantly adjusting for what you can and cannot do. She had avoided routines. She had varied her grocery runs, her pharmacy visits, the route she took on her short daily walks, because she understood that whoever had orchestrated her removal from the estate had not done so on a casual basis. People who operate on that level do not simply let a variable walk away. She had been nearly invisible for 5 months. The granddaughter's name was Petra, and she was 17, and she came every Thursday and sat with Mr. Hatch in the front of the shop while he sorted through returned items, and she had a laugh that traveled through the floorboards. Elena had started timing her Thursday errands to coincide with Petra's visits, because the sound of the laughing made the room feel less like a waiting room for something terrible. On a Thursday in the 5th month, Elena came back from the pharmacy to find a folded piece of paper slipped under her door. No envelope, just paper folded once. She stood in the doorway for a moment before picking it up. Then she picked it up and unfolded it. You have 3 days. It's somewhere safe. They found the Farwell address. She did not know who E was. She had not told anyone about this address. The only person in the world who might have had enough access to parallel systems to locate a cash rental under a false name and enough residual concern to warn rather than report was a woman she had worked with briefly in the estates. Administrative office 3 years ago, a woman named Elise Caron, who had left the organization quietly after a disagreement with management that no one had ever fully explained. Elena turned the paper over, nothing on the back. She sat down on the bed. She pressed both hands flat on her stomach, which was not flat anymore, which had become the most visible and irrefutable evidence that the consequences of the night she left Blackridge were not only hers to carry. 3 days. She looked at the wall, at the 4 sheets of paper taped together, at the diagram she had been building for 5 months, crossing out names and rewriting them, circling patterns and drawing lines between structures until the architecture of the thing was clear enough that she could see not Victor, not Marcus, not Caruso Trent acting as originator, rather than instrument, but the layer behind all of them. The layer that connected to a symbol on a photograph in a drawer Adrian never left unlocked. She had one piece she still couldn't place. One name that appeared in the routing structure in a way she couldn't parse, that connected to a notarized document sealed with the 2 triangle mark, that predated the current operation by almost 2 decades. The name was Rowan Voss, Adrian's father. She had been afraid to follow that thread. She had told herself it was because the evidence was thin, because a single notarized seal wasn't enough, because she needed more before she could bring something that explosive anywhere near Adrian. She had been lying to herself. She was afraid because if that thread led where she thought it led, the thing she was going to have to tell Adrian was not just that his organization had a traitor. It was that his entire life had been built on the edge of a crater that someone had been slowly filling in beneath him for 20 years. She pulled the paper diagram off the wall. She folded it carefully, added it to the waterproof folder, repacked both bags, and was out the door before midnight. She didn't leave a note. She didn't say goodbye to Mr. Hatch or to Petra or to the room that had kept her safe through a winter and most of a spring. She left the way she had left the estate quietly in the dark, carrying everything she had managed to preserve. This time at least, she knew where she was going. She drove for 2 hours before she let herself stop. Not because 2 hours was enough distance, but because the baby had been moving against her ribs for the last 40 minutes, in a way that was becoming impossible to ignore, and the gas gauge was sitting at just above a quarter tank. And the rain had started again, a thin, needling rain that wasn't dramatic enough to be frightening, but made the road ahead disappear in increments, the headlights catching it and turning it into static. She pulled off at a truck stop outside a town called Merritt's Hollow, a place so small it didn't have a hotel, only a diner that was still lit at 2 in the morning and a gas station attached to it by a covered walkway. She filled the tank, paid cash, bought a bottle of water and a sleeve of crackers from the vending machine inside the diner, and sat in a corner booth with her bags under the table and her back to the wall. The waitress was a woman in her late 50s, with the posture of someone who had been on her feet since before Elena was born. She brought coffee without being asked, looked at Elena's stomach once without comment, and left her alone. Elena was grateful in the specific, slightly desperate way that pregnancy made her grateful for small kindnesses intensely, disproportionately, with a tightness in the throat that she refused to give in to. She spread the diagram on the table, kept flat under her forearm, and looked at it again. Rowan Voss. The name had appeared 3 times in the document chain. Once as a signatory on a 1987 incorporation, filing for a company called Ariston Group, which had been dissolved in 1994. Once as a reference name on a notarized property transfer in the Harbor District, the same district where Daniel Cho had been signing accelerated permits. And once, most recently, as a listed beneficiary on a dormant insurance instrument held inside the Sarant capital structure, which should have been impossible, because Rowan Voss had been dead for 9 years. You don't stay a beneficiary on a live financial instrument after you're dead, unless someone with system access keeps renewing the designation. Which meant some son inside Sarant Capital, or someone with control over it, was maintaining Rowan Voss's name in the architecture deliberately. Not by oversight, not by administrative lag, deliberately. Elena ate 3 crackers and drank half the water. Outside, a semi pulled in and the driver got out and stretched his back in the rain without bothering to pull up his hood. And there was something almost settling about watching a person be that indifferent to weather. She thought about Elise Caron, about the note slipped under the door. They found the Farwell address. The word they was the one that kept snagging. Not he found or someone found. They plural. Which either meant Elise was being imprecise, using the collective because she didn't know exactly who, or it meant there was more than one person with eyes on Elena's location, which meant the operation had more personnel than she had mapped. She needed to talk to someone, not for comfort. For verification, a second set of eyes on the diagram, someone who could look at the Rowan Voss thread and tell her whether she was seeing a real pattern or manufacturing one. Out of 5 months of isolation and insufficient sleep, and the particular way pregnancy could make everything feel simultaneously too sharp and slightly unreal. She had one option. She had been avoiding it for months because using it meant exposing herself to a system she wasn't sure was clean. But 3 days was not a large window, and she was driving without a destination. And the thing she was carrying in the waterproof folder was either enough to pull Adrian Voss back from the edge of a catastrophic mistake, or it was nothing, just paper, just a theory. Just the work of a woman who had been alone too long and started connecting dots that weren't connected. She needed to know which one it was before she decided what to do with it. She folded the diagram back along its creases, finished the water, left $3 on the table for the waitress, and walked back to the car. She had Elise Caron's number in the notebook. She had been carrying it for 5 months without using it. She used it now. Elise picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been awake, which meant she had been waiting. "You got the note," Elise said. Not a question. "I got it. Are you safe?" "For now." "I'm not at home. You shouldn't be at Farwell." "I'm not. I'm in a truck stop in Merritt's Hollow." Elena kept her voice low, even though she was alone in the car with the windows up and rain coming down. "Elise, how did you find the address?" A pause. Controlled, not uncertain. "I still have access to some of the administrative routing systems. Not all of them, they cycled the credentials after I left, but the secondary archival access wasn't scrubbed completely. I pulled a cross-reference on cash rental registrations inside a 12-mile radius of the estate, filtered by payment structure." Another pause. "It took me 4 months to narrow it down. You were careful." "Not careful enough. You were careful enough that I almost missed it. Someone with more resources than me found it faster." Elise's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. A fatigue that went past tired, the kind that settles into the bones and changes the way a person carries themselves. "They're not moving yet. That's why I gave you 3 days instead of 1. But they will move. And when they do, it'll be clean, nothing traceable back to the organization. Because the point isn't to create a scene. The point is to remove a variable." Elena's hand tightened around the phone. "Elise, I need you to look at something. I can't meet you. I'm not asking you to meet me. I'm going to describe a document structure, and I need you to tell me if what I'm seeing makes sense to someone who knows how these systems work. She pressed on before Elise could object. Ariston Group, Incorporated 1,000. 987, dissolved 1,994. Rowan Voss listed as signatory. Sarant Capital, current active status, holding Rowan Voss as a dormant beneficiary on an insurance instrument. The same authentication seal on both documents, two overlapping triangles inside a circle. She waited. Does that mean anything to you? The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Elena checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Elise, where did you get the Ariston Group documents? Caruso Trent showed them to me. As part of a package he claimed implicated Victor Dane. Victor Dane isn't in those documents. I know, I figured that out. Elena kept her voice even. Trent was using the Victor angle as misdirection. Victor was the visible name. The real structure runs deeper. How deep have you gone? Sarant Capital, through 3 shell entities, connects to a law firm that also incorporated 2 of Trent's own shell structures. Which means Trent isn't the origin point either. He's another layer. She paused. Rowan Voss is the through line. He connects Ariston Group in 1,987 to the current Sarant structure. Someone is keeping his name active in the system 20 years after he built it and 9 years after he died. Another silence. Shorter this time, the seal, Elise said. The 2 triangles. That's not a company mark. It's a personal authentication, the kind that was used before digital certification. Notaries used them in the late 80s and early 90s for high-value private instruments. A seal like that would only appear on documents the original signatory personally authorized. Her voice had gone careful, precise, the voice of someone measuring each word before releasing it. If Rowan Voss's seal appears on a document dated after his death, Elena, that document was either backdated or it was forged using a reproduction of his seal. Or someone who had legitimate access to his seal used it after he died. His heir, Elise said quietly. The word landed in the car like something with physical weight. Elena stared at the rain on the windshield. I need more time. You don't have more time. That's what I'm telling you. Elise's voice shifted slightly, not louder, but more direct, the careful precision dropping enough to let something urgent through. Elena, whatever you've built, you need to move it somewhere safe. Paper, digital copies, everything. Multiple locations, people you trust outside the organization. And then you need to decide who you're taking it to, because sitting on this alone isn't a strategy anymore. It's a countdown. If I take it to Adrian, I know what happens if you take it to Adrian before you have the complete picture. You know too. Elise paused. He sent you away once already believing a photograph over your own voice. What happens when you come back with a theory that his father built the foundation for the thing that's eating his organization? Elena didn't answer. Get somewhere safe, Elise said. And Elena, be careful who you trust with the digital copies. The system that found your Farwell address isn't stupid. If you use familiar networks, they'll trace the access. I understand. I'll try to reach you again in 48 hours. If you don't hear from me, assume the window closed and act on what you have. The call ended. Elena sat in the truck stop parking lot for another 10 minutes, listening to the rain before she started the car. Back at the Blackridge estate, Adrian Voss had stopped sleeping in the bedroom. He hadn't made a conscious decision about it. It had happened gradually. He'd fall asleep at the desk, wake up in the early hours with his neck stiff and documents under his cheek, and find that he had no particular motivation to move to the bed, which was too large and too quiet, and smelled still faintly, like the shampoo Elena used. He'd taken to keeping a blanket on the couch in the study. Victor had noticed and said nothing, which Adrian appreciated and also found, in moments he didn't examine carefully, slightly unnerving. It was Victor who brought him the security report on a cold Tuesday morning in the 6th month. He set it on the desk without preamble, which was his way, and stood with his arms crossed while Adrian read it. The report was 3 pages. The relevant portion was on page 2, an anomaly in the administrative access logs, flagged by their digital security monitor, showing that a secondary archival credential one that should have been deactivated 11 months ago, when an administrative staff member left the organization, had been used to run a cross-reference. Query on cash rental registrations in the local area. The credential belonged to Elise Caron. Adrian read it twice. Set it down. She's been inside the archive, he said. Not the active systems. The archival layer only. Whoever scrubbed her access after she left missed the secondary credential. Victor's voice was even. Informational. The query she ran was specific. Cash rentals 12-mile radius filtered by payment structure. She was looking for someone living off the grid nearby. Adrian looked up. Elena. That would be my red. A silence settled between them. Adrian leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, which was something he did when he was working through something he didn't want to say out loud. Elise Caron left the organization, he said slowly, because of a disagreement with management. That's what's on record. What's not on record? Victor's jaw moved slightly. She raised questions about a procurement arrangement. The Harbor District contracts the series that went through merit development. She thought the approval chain was irregular. She was told it was above her clearance level. Who told her? Victor met his eyes, Marcus Webb. The name moved through the room without either of them acknowledging what it meant directly. Adrian had known Marcus Webb for 8 years. Marcus ran household security at the estate, managed the physical access protocols, controlled the guest authorization process. He was unremarkable in the way that genuinely useful people often are present everywhere, noticed nowhere, the kind of man whose competence expressed itself through problems that never quite materialized. The kind of man, Adrian thought, who could slip an authorization memo into a security clearance log with his own name on it and make it read like someone else's signature. He thought about the night Elena had told him about the stranger at the estate. Marcus let him through, said you'd approved a guest list for the afternoon. Your name was apparently on the authorization. He had assumed she was lying, or confused, or that Trent had coached her on what to say to make the story stick. He hadn't looked at the authorization log himself. Pull the log, Adrian said. The day Elena says a man came to the estate. Pull the full access record for that date. Victor didn't ask which date. He already knew. You want me to do that now? I want you to do that right now. Victor left the room. Adrian sat at his desk and looked at the 3-page security report and thought about the sound Elena's voice had made in the study that night, not the words, but the specific quality of her voice, the controlled steadiness of someone who has rehearsed remaining calm but is operating at the very edge of it. He thought about how he knew that quality because he had heard it in himself in his own voice, during conversations where the truth was something he was protecting from people who had already decided not to believe him. He thought about the ring in the music box. He hadn't moved the music box, hadn't opened it, had walked past it every day for 6 months and not touched it. He stood up from the desk and walked to the bookcase. The music box was exactly where Elena had placed it. Rosewood, tarnished brass, a small latch on the underside that he had never noticed in 4 years of looking at the thing. Picked it up, found the latch, pressed it. The compartment in the base was small, barely the size of his thumb. Inside it, the ring caught the morning light from the study windows and threw a thin line of refracted white across the back of his hand. He picked the ring up and held it. There was something engraved on the inside of the band. He had to tilt it toward the light to read it. It wasn't the inscription he had written there, A and E, always that was on the outer face of the band, and he knew it. This was different, smaller, pressed into the metal on the interior surface, in a hand he didn't recognize. 2 overlapping triangles inside a circle. He stared at it for a long time. When Victor came back through the door, Adrian was still standing at the bookcase with the ring in his hand. The authorization log, Victor said, stopping when he saw Adrian's face. What is it? Adrian held up the ring. There's a mark on this. Inside the band. I need you to tell me if you've seen it before. Victor crossed the room and looked at the engraving. His face did something quick and almost involuntary, a tightening around the eyes, that lasted less than a second before he controlled it, but Adrian caught it because he had spent 11 years learning how to read Victor Dane's face. You've seen it, Adrian said. I've seen the symbol. Not on this. Victor straightened up. It's an authentication mark. Private instrument, pre-digital, late 80s, early 90s vintage. He paused. I saw it on one document once. Years ago. What document? Victor looked at him. His expression was the expression of a man who has reached a door he has been circling for a long time, and is now standing in front of it. A file your father kept, Victor said quietly. A file I was never supposed to see. Came across it when I was helping catalog the estate records after he died. Put it back and never mentioned it, because I didn't understand what it was, and Rowan Voss was dead, and I decided some things were better left. The silence in the room was absolute. Tell me, Adrian said. The file was labeled Ariston, Victor said. It was a corporate record. Very old. Rowan Voss was listed as the founding signatory. He held Adrian's gaze. But there was a second signatory, someone I didn't recognize. The name meant nothing to me at the time. What was the name? Daniel Hargrove. Victor watched Adrian's face. Does that mean something to you? Adrian set the ring down on the shelf carefully. Daniel Hargrove is the current federal task force coordinator running the investigation into Harbor District corruption. He said it with no expression at all. He's been running that investigation for 14 months. The weight of that landed in the room slowly, the way large things fall not all at once, but in stages, each piece arriving with its own impact. Your father, Victor said carefully, and the man who is currently investigating your organizations were partners. In 1987, Adrian's voice was completely flat. And someone has been using my father's authentication seal on active documents in the current period. Someone who either had access to the original seal or knew how to reproduce it. He looked at Victor. Pull the authorization log. Do it now and find Marcus Webb. I want him in this building within the hour. Victor was already moving toward the door. Victor. Adrian stopped him. If Webb isn't findable if he's gone, if his access cards have been used in the last 24 hours to retrieve anything from the secure file room, I need to know immediately. Victor paused in the doorway. And if that's what I find. Adrian picked the ring up again, held it in his closed fist. Then we have a very serious problem, he said, and we've had it for a long time, and I have been standing in the middle of it without knowing. Victor left. Adrian opened his fist and looked at the ring again. He thought about Elena's voice in this room 6 months ago. I was trying to protect you from acting on incomplete information, the way you always do. He thought about her hands clasped at her waist. He thought about the rain and the open door and himself standing at it like he was doing her a favor by letting her leave. He thought about the baby. He closed his fist around the ring again and pressed it hard against his sternum. Not a gesture of sentiment, but a physical restraint, the way you press against a wound to keep something from getting out. He stood there until Victor's footsteps had faded completely down the hall. Then he went to the bottom drawer of his desk and unlocked it, and retrieved the photograph of Elena and Caruso Trent, and looked at it properly for the first time since the night he'd locked it away. He looked at Elena's hands in the photograph, both of them visible, flat on the table, no documents between them. He looked at her posture upright, slightly pulled back, the posture of someone enduring a conversation rather than conducting one. He looked at her face, which was not quite focused on the man across from her, but slightly to his left, toward the window, the way a person looks when they are calculating an exit. He had looked at this photograph once 6 months ago and seen a traitor sitting across from his enemy. He looked at it now and saw a woman who was frightened and trying very hard not to show it. He put the photograph in his breast pocket. Marcus Webb had not come to work that morning. Victor reported this 20 minutes later. Standing in the doorway of the study, with his phone still in his hand and his face arranged in the careful neutral that meant he had already processed the worst interpretation and was now delivering information instead of reaction. His access card was used at 2:47 this morning, Victor said. Secure file room, sublevel 2. He pulled 3 physical files and 1 external drive from the archive. The card was deactivated automatically at exit per protocol, but the exit log doesn't show him leaving the building through any of the monitored doors, which means he used the service corridor, which means he knew exactly what he was doing and had a plan for leaving that didn't involve the cameras. Victor paused. His phone is off. His apartment I had Garrett run by is empty. Not packed, just empty. Bed made, dishes clean, no sign of a fast exit. Planned, Adrian said, yes, which means he knew we were going to pull the authorization log. Adrian stood up from the desk, which means someone told him. The room went quiet in a specific way, the quiet of 2 men who have worked together long enough that they don't need to say the obvious thing out loud to understand that they are both thinking it. Someone inside this building had tipped Marcus Webb. Someone who had known, before Victor left the study, that Adrian was about to start pulling threads. Adrian looked at Victor. Victor looked back at him with 11 years of shared history in his face and something else beneath it, a controlled, barely visible hurt that he was not going to name out loud, because naming it would make the implication explicit. And both of them knew Adrian well enough to know that naming it directly was the fastest way to make him unreachable. I didn't tell anyone, Victor said. Quiet, level, not defensive. The voice of a man who has decided to say the true thing simply and let it stand on its own. I know, Adrian said. He said it because he did know. Because the thing that had been building in him for the last 20 minutes, since he'd seen the Ariston symbol on the sits inside of Elena's ring, was not suspicion of Victor. It was something worse, the slow, nauseating recognition that he had spent 6 months believing the wrong story so completely that the right one had had time to metastasize into something he was only now beginning to see the full shape of. The file's web-pulled, Adrian said. Can you tell from the archive index which ones? Garrett's working on it. Victor checked his phone. We'll have a list in the next 15 minutes. Adrian walked to the window. The grounds were damp from the previous night's rain, the lawn darker than it should be in the late morning light, the trees at the far edge of the property standing without wind. Everything out there looked exactly as it always had, and he understood now, in a way he had not understood before, that that was precisely the point. Everything looking unchanged was not evidence of stability. It was evidence of concealment. Someone, Adrian said, to the window, has been running a parallel operation inside this organization for a very long time. Using my father's name, my father's corporate architecture, my father's authentication seal. They used Elena to create a distraction, to give me a reason to send away the one person who was actively investigating from the inside. He paused. And it worked. Victor said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that. Adrian said, 6 weeks after she left. Left a message with the service. I remember. I didn't call back because I decided she was working with Trent. He turned from the window. His face, which had been composed since the moment Victor had walked back in with the empty apartment report, showed something now, not grief, not anger. Both of those were further down, and he'd get to them. What showed was the particular expression of a man who has just understood that an error was not a mistake, but a choice, and that choices are things you have to live in. Victor. If someone were trying to locate a woman who had left this estate with sensitive documents, living off-grid for 6 months, how would they approach finding her? Victor went still. Administrative cross-reference, he said slowly. Cash rental registrations. Filtered search. Limited radius. He looked at Adrian. The same method Elise Karen used. Yes, Adrian's voice was careful. Tight. Which means whoever is running this operation used the same method. Which means if Karan found Elena's address 4 days ago, they found it before she did. Victor's voice had gone low. Simultaneously, Elena is not at the Farwell address anymore. Adrian said it with more certainty than he had any right to, and Victor didn't challenge it because he understood not wishful thinking, but the particular certainty of a man who knows the person he's thinking about. She would have had warning. She would have moved. You don't know that. She had been careful enough to stay hidden for 5 months. She wouldn't leave a thread that led straight to her without having planned for what came next. He paused. But she's out there with documents that someone very dangerous needs to recover. She's 6 or 7 months pregnant, and the only people who might know where she went. He stopped. His phone rang. He looked at the screen, unknown number. Different pattern from any of the organization's internal routing. He answered it. You found the ring, Elena said. Her voice was the same as it always was, slightly lower than you expected, controlled to the point of sounding almost flat until you knew her well enough to hear what was underneath. She sounded exhausted and alert. At the same time, the way people sound when adrenaline has been doing the work that sleep should have done for too long. Adrian closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. Where are you? He said. Not at Farwell. I'm safe for the moment. A pause. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen without deciding anything until I'm done. Elena, I need you to say you'll listen. He looked at Victor, who had turned toward the window with his back to the room, giving Adrian the only privacy the room allowed. I'm listening, Adrian said. Rowan Voss built a company in 1987 called Ariston Group. He had a partner. The partner's name was Daniel Hargrove. She paused. Hargrove is now the Federal Task Force Coordinator investigating your organization. The investigation isn't neutral. It was never neutral. It was built from the inside by someone using your father's corporate architecture as a foundation, and it has been running for 14 months with the specific goal of dismantling your legitimate holdings so that the underlying structure, the one your father built with Hargrove in 1987, can be repositioned under new control. Another pause, shorter. Victor isn't the traitor. He never was. The traitor is the person who made you believe Victor could be, so that you would stop trusting the one person in your inner circle who was actually clean. Adrian stood in the middle of his study, with his dead father's ring in his breast pocket and his phone against his ear, and let the architecture of the last 6 months rearrange itself in his mind, not slowly, not comfortably, but all at once. The way a structure fails, fast and complete, and without any of the gradual warning signs you should have noticed earlier. Marcus Webb left the building at 2:47 this morning, he said, with files. I know, Elise Caron told me. Adrian, Webb isn't freelancing. He's been the relay point. The operation needed someone inside your physical security to manage access, who came in, what they saw, what got moved. Webb is the reason a man with a manufactured photograph walked into your house and walked out again with no record. Her voice was still controlled, but something was shifting in it, the controlled quality getting harder to maintain, not from emotion, but from the effort of saying all of it out loud after carrying it alone for so long. I wasn't working with Trent. I was never working with Trent. I sat across that table for 40 minutes, and I was terrified every single second, and I photographed everything he showed me, and I spent 5 months trying to understand what it meant. Isena, he said, and his voice came out different from how he'd intended. Not controlled, not composed. Just her name in his voice, with everything he hadn't let himself feel for 6 months pressing up behind it. Don't, she said quietly. Not right now, I need you to focus. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. Then, tell me what you need. I need to get the documents somewhere they can't be recovered. Physical copies and digital. Multiple locations. And I need you to know where Hargrove is right now and whether he has any way of knowing that you've started pulling threads. She paused. Because if he knows, we have hours. If he doesn't know yet, we have slightly more than that. Victor, Adrian said, not moving the phone from his ear. Victor turned from the window. Get me Hargrove's current location. Every resource we have now. Adrian kept his eyes on Victor's face as he said it, watching for anything that registered wrong. And what he saw instead was something that looked almost like relief, the relief of a man who has been waiting for a particular shoe to drop for a very long time and has finally heard it hit the floor. Already moving, Victor said, and was through the door before the words had finished. Adrian brought the phone back fully to his ear. Elena. Are you alone? Yes. Are you physically all right? A pause. Not a long one. We're both all right. The we hit him somewhere in the center of his chest and stayed there. Don't move from where you are until I call you back on this number. His voice had the quality it got when he was past the emotional part and into the operational part, the part that had kept him alive and functional for 20 years. Don't contact Elise Caron again. Her access has been flagged, which means she's visible. Don't use any network connected to this organization. I know all of this, Adrian. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. He paused. I'm sorry. Another pause. Longer this time. Call me back, she said, and the call ended. Adrian stood in his empty study with the phone in his hand and the ring in his pocket and the photograph of Elena against Caruso Trent in his breast pocket. And for one moment, just one, he let himself understand completely what he had done. Not the organizational mistake, not the operational failure, but the specific human thing. The man who had stood at an open door in the rain and watched his pregnant wife walk into the dark because he had chosen the story that required less of him over the truth that required everything. Then he folded it up and put it somewhere he could carry it without letting it stop him from moving. He had a phone call to make. He had a task force coordinator to locate. And somewhere for outside this building, in a car on a road he didn't know the name of, Elena was driving with their child and a folder full of documents that someone was prepared to kill to recover. He was not going to let that be the ending. He picked up the desk phone and started making calls, and his voice, when it came out, was the voice his organization knew cold, specific, and entirely without hesitation. But his free hand, pressed flat against the desk to keep it steady, was shaking. The calls Adrian made in the next 40 minutes were not the kind that left records. He used 3 different phones, the desk line for the first 2, a burner from the bottom of the safe behind the bookcase for the third, and he spoke in the clipped, directive shorthand that his organization understood as the register of genuine urgency, as opposed to the slightly more expansive version he used when the urgency was performative. The people he called did not ask questions. They confirmed, reported, and disconnected. That was what he paid them for. By the time Victor returned to the study, Adrian had a partial picture of Daniel Hargrove's current movements. Partial because Hargrove was a federal coordinator with his own security architecture, his own counter-surveillance habits, his own reasons to keep his schedule opaque. But partial was enough to work from. Hargrove was not at the federal field office. His official vehicle had been logged, leaving the office parking structure at 6:14 that morning and had not returned. His assistant had told 2 separate callers that he was in transit between meetings, the kind of answer that means nothing and is designed to. His personal phone was going to voicemail. "He's moving," Adrian said when Victor finished the report. "Yes, which means he already knows we started pulling threads." Victor set his phone down on the desk. If Marcus Webb contacted him after leaving the buildings. Webb left at 2:47. We started pulling the authorization log at Adrian stopped. Did the math. At 9:15 this morning. Webb had a 6-hour window. He looked at Victor. More than enough. Victor's jaw tightened. If Hargrove knows you're looking at the Ariston connection, he's not going to wait. He'll move to lock down the Sarant capital structure and create distance between himself and the active documents. He'll make it look like an investigative pivot, reorganize the task force focus, redirect resources, put Webb in a position where he becomes the visible liability instead of the protected asset. Webb becomes the fall, Adrian said. Webb becomes the fall. Clean, documented, traceable to organizational misconduct rather than federal coordination. Hargrove walks away with his hands clear and 14 months of groundwork intact. Victor paused. And your organization takes the exposure hit from whatever Webb pulled from the archive last night. Adrian stood up from the desk. He did it slowly, the way he did everything in this particular register, without urgency in the body, the urgency entirely internal, contained behind his sternum and behind his eyes, and nowhere else. He walked to the window. The grounds were the same as they had been an hour ago, unchanged, deceiving. I need the files Webb took, Adrian said. What was in the archive? Physical or digital copies of whatever he pulled. I need to know what Hargrove has his hands on. Garrett's still working the index. We should have it in. Adrian's burner phone rang. Not the desk line. The burner which he had given to no one. Which had one number stored in it, the unknown number Elena had called from. He picked it up. They're at the motel, Elena said. Her voice was different from 20 minutes ago. Still controlled, but the control was working harder, and underneath it was something he hadn't heard in her voice before. Not in 4 years the specific pitch of someone who is physically afraid and choosing not to be paralyzed by it. What motel? You said you were safe. I was. I'm at the Pine Ridge Motor Inn on Route 9, room 114. I saw a car in the parking lot when I pulled in. I didn't think anything of it. Dark sedan, tinted windows, could have been anyone. But it's been sitting there with the engine running for 40 minutes, and it hasn't moved. A short breath. Adrian. 2 men just got out. They're at the front office. Adrian was already moving. Can you get out of the room? The window faces the lot, if they have someone at the back. Don't go out the window. Is there an interior door? A connecting room? Anything? There's a door to the adjacent room. It's locked from the other side. Break it. A pause. Adrian, I'm 8 months pregnant. I know. Use your shoulder at the lock plate, not the door itself. Hit it low. Do it now and keep talking to me. He was across the study and in the hall before she could respond, phone pressed to his ear, and Victor was behind him without being told to follow, because 11 years of working together had made certain things automatic. He heard through the phone the sound of Elena moving, the sound of something hitting wood, once, twice, a crack of old hardware giving. I'm through, she said, slightly breathless. Go to the far side of the adjacent room, away from the exterior wall. Getlow, are the documents with you? The folder is on me. I put it in my bag before I called you. Good. Stay on the phone. He was at the estate's rear exit now, Victor pulling keys. How long since the men went into the office? 3 minutes. Maybe 4. Motel staff will give them the room number in under a minute if they show credentials. If Hargrove's people have task force ID, they'll have it. Elena's voice was flat. She understood operational reality. She had spent 6 months living inside it alone. Listen to me. When you hear footsteps in the hall outside 114, you do not move. You do not make sound. You wait until they go into 114 before you come out of the adjacent room. Then you go left down the hall, away from the parking lot side, to the rear exit. Is there a rear exit? There's a door at the end of the hall. Emergency exit, take it, it'll alarm. That's fine, that's what we want. It'll split their attention. Go to the road, not the parking lot, and you walk until you see headlights coming from the north. He was in the car now, Victor driving, the estate gate already opening. I'm 40 minutes from you if we push it, Adrian. Her voice dropped. These men are federal. They're not acting in a federal capacity. They're acting in Hargrove's capacity. There's a difference, and it matters legally. And right now, it also matters practically, because it means they don't want a scene with witnesses. He heard her breathing even out, slightly the information helping, giving her structure to operate within. You understand me. I understand. Tell me what you hear. Silence, 3 seconds, 4. Footsteps, she said. In the hall. 2 sets. He said nothing. Victor had the car at 70 and climbing the eastern road ahead of them flat and mostly empty in the late morning. The sky had gone gray again, the thin rain from the night before thinking about returning. They're at 114, Elena said, very quiet. Adrian pressed the phone hard against his ear. A pause, long enough to be unbearable. They're inside, she said. They went in. Move now, go. He heard her move. Heard the adjacent room door. Heard her footsteps on what sounded like thin carpet, then the change to tile, then the crash bar sound of an emergency exit, and then the alarm sharp, continuous. Exactly what he needed, and then her breathing in the open air. I'm out, she said. I'm on the road. Keep walking north. Do not stop. He looked at Victor. How far? 32 minutes, Victor said, eyes on the road. 32 minutes, Adrian said into the phone. Keep talking to me. She kept talking. Not about the operation, not about the documents, not about Hargrove or Webb or the Ariston group. She talked about the road, the color of the sky, the sound the emergency exit alarm was still making, fading behind her. The way the gravel felt under her shoes, which were not the right shoes for walking on gravel. A fact she reported with a dryness that came from somewhere deep in her that still, even now, had the capacity for the flat observation that passed in her as humor. She talked about the baby. Not directly, she wasn't going to do that on an open line. But she said we're fine, periodically, the way someone checks a reading on a gauge. We're fine, still moving. Adrian listened to every word and said almost nothing and drove. Victor didn't speak either. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes forward. And his jaw set in the particular way it set when he was running calculations he hadn't been asked for, processing variables in parallel with whoever was speaking, which was one of the things that made him irreplaceable and also occasionally maddening. They were 18 minutes out when Elena said, car. Adrian straightened. Where behind me? Coming slow. Dark sedan. Different car or same? It might be the same. It's moving too slow for the road speed. Don't look back directly. Turn as if you're checking traffic and look once. A pause. What do you see? One driver, no visible passenger. He's not stopping. He's pacing me. Her voice had gone to its flattest register, the one that meant she was managing something very specific and would deal with the emotional dimension of it later, possibly never. Adrian. He's going to try to stop the car ahead of you. I know. Keep walking. Don't engage. Don't speak to him if he stops. There's a turn ahead, a side road. Don't take it. Anything that gets you off the main road reduces your visibility. I know that. I'm telling you, because there's something at the turn. A pause. Truck. Parked. Driver's side facing me. Another pause. The driver is Marcus Webb. The inside of the car went completely silent. Adrian felt something happen in his chest, not panic, but the close relative of it, the thing that comes just before a situation, exceeds the boundary of what you can manage through planning and becomes something you can only move through and hope. Elena, stop walking. If I stop walking and tell me exactly what you see. Webb's position, the sedan's position, everything. She stopped. He heard her breathing. controlled, counting it down the way she did. Webb's truck is at the turnoff, 20 meters ahead of me. He's out of the truck now, standing by the driver's door. He's looking at me. A pause. He doesn't have his hands in his pockets. That meant visible hands, which meant in the specific grammar of this world that he was trying to communicate non-aggression. The sedan, Adrian said. It stopped, maybe 30 meters behind me. The driver is still inside, a situation with a person in front and a vehicle behind. Elena in the middle on a road with no cover, 8 months pregnant, carrying documents that at least 2 operations had spent considerable resources trying to recover. Webb, Adrian said, is he moving toward you? No. He's waving me toward the truck, a pause. He's waving me off the road. Don't move, Adrian. The sedan's door just opened. Get to the truck. You just said, get to the truck now. Webb wants those documents alive, which means he wants you alive, which is more than we know about what's in the sedan. His voice was completely level. Move. He heard her move, heard her breathing shift, as she walked faster than a woman 8 months pregnant should have to walk on a gravel shoulder. Heard a car door, the sound of it being pulled open from outside, and then the close acoustic of a vehicle interior, and then a door closing. I'm in, she said. Is Webb driving? He's getting in. He's... A sound. The truck's starting. We're moving. He's taking the side road, Elena. I know. Her voice was steady. I'm going to handle this. Put him on. A shuffling. Then a man's voice, flat, middle-aged, carrying the particular texture of someone who has been under continuous stress for long enough that stress has become his default register. Mr. Voss, Marcus Webb said. Give me one reason, Adrian said. A silence that lasted exactly long enough to feel considered. Because Hargrove told me she'd be handled quietly, and I didn't know what that meant until this morning, Webb said. And because when I understood what it meant, I stopped being able to live with it. His voice was rough. Not emotional, or not primarily emotional. Rough the way a surface is rough when the finish has been stripped off it. I pulled those files to give to you, not to him. I knew you'd start looking, and I needed you to have what I had before Hargrove locked the structure down. You've been working for him for how long? 4 years. And in 4 years, you never had a problem with it until this morning. In 4 years, I moved paper and managed access and told myself it was organizational accounting. This morning, I was told to confirm a location so a team could go collect a problem. Webb's voice dropped. She's 8 months pregnant, Mr. Voss. I know what I've done. I'm not asking you to clear my account. I'm asking you to let me put her somewhere safe before I give you everything I have on Hargrove. Adrian looked at Victor. Victor was already on his own phone, running a quiet parallel track, and he gave Adrian a single nod that meant, I can work with this. Keep him talking. Where are you taking her? Adrian said. There's a property outside Merritt's Hollow, off the county road. It belonged to my wife's family, nothing in my name, nothing connected to the organization or the task force. I've been making sure it was clean for 3 months. A pause. I knew this was going to break eventually. I wanted somewhere to go. How long to get there? 20 minutes. Victor will have eyes on the property inside of 15. If anything about that location reads wrong, nothing will read wrong. Adrian held the phone for a moment, then put Elena back on. A shuffling. Then her voice, I'm here, do you believe him? Pause. She was thinking about it seriously, not reflexively. He could feel the quality of the pause, not the stalling pause. He didn't have to come to the road, she said finally. The sedan was already pacing me. If he wanted the documents and not a witness, he could have let them collect me and taken the folder after. A short breath. He came to the road. So yes, for now all right. Adrian looked at the road ahead. 14 minutes out. Stay on the phone. I've been on the phone for 40 minutes. I know. Another pause. Smaller this time. You're scared, she said. Not an accusation. Just an observation. In the voice she used for things she wanted to name accurately rather than manage. Yes, he said. It was the most uncomplicated thing he had said in 6 months. The property outside Merritt's Hollow was a farmhouse that had stopped being a farm about 15 years before anyone had gotten around to acknowledging it. Victor's contact confirmed it was clean, no surveillance equipment, no active registrations, no vehicles parked within visual range. Webb pulled the truck around to the back of the house and cut the engine. and he and Elena sat in the cab for a moment, in the particular silence of two people who have just survived something together and haven't yet decided what they are to each other now. Elena got out first. She moved carefully, the way she had learned to move in the 8th month, deliberate, reading the ground before she committed her weight, one hand touching the doorframe for steadiness. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on when she'd walked out of the Pineridge Motor Inn, and she had the bag across her body with the waterproof folder inside it, and she looked at the farmhouse, and then at Webb, who had come around the side of the truck and was standing with his hands visible, the way he had stood on the road. Inside, he said, "It's warmer. I stocked it last week." She went inside. Webb had been telling the truth about the stocking. There was food in the small kitchen, a working space heater in the main room, and clean water from a tank rather than the county line, which meant no utility record of occupancy. Elena put her bag on the kitchen table, sat in a chair, and looked at Marcus Webb, who remained standing and seemed to understand that sitting down was not something he had been offered. "Tell me about Hargrove," she said. Webb told her. He told her for 45 minutes, speaking in the flat, methodical way of a man who has rehearsed this particular accounting, who has been building it in his head for some time and knows it needs to be complete because there will be so second chance to deliver it. He told her about the 4 years these initial approach, which had come through a legitimate federal channel and been presented as an authorized cooperation arrangement. He told her about the escalation, the way the requests had moved from information sharing to active document management to physical access facilitation, each step arriving as a natural extension of the one before, each step slightly past the line the previous one had established, until one day he had looked at where he was standing and understood that the line he'd been watching for had been behind him for a very long time. He told her about Hargrove's operation, the structure of it, not Ariston Group, which was the foundation, the historical architecture, the original instrument Rowan Voss had built, and Hargrove had inherited control of through a succession mechanism in the original incorporation documents that no one had ever examined closely because Rowan Voss was dead and Ariston Group was dissolved. And the past in Adrian Voss's organization was something you didn't pick at if you wanted to keep working. He told her about the Sarant capital structure, the shell layers, the permit manipulation, the way Daniel Cho connected to Hargrove through a property arrangement that predated Cho's employment in the municipal office by 2 years, which meant Hargrove had placed him there deliberately, which meant the Harbor District was not a target of opportunity, but a planned position. He told her about the task force, the way it had been constructed not to prosecute Adrian Voss's organization, but to appear to prosecute it, generating enough legal pressure to destabilize the legitimate holdings, push the organization toward financial exposure, and create a window for Sarant Capital to move in and absorb the destabilized assets at distressed prices through a series of apparently unrelated acquisitions. And he told her about the photograph. Hargrove staged the restaurant meeting, Webb said. He told Trent to reach out to your wife. Gave Trent a script, the story about the internal traitor, the Victor Dane angle. Trent's people took the photograph from outside, then cleaned it up to remove the context. Your wife was sitting at a table in a public restaurant with a man she'd never met, trying to get information she could bring back to your husband. The photograph made it look like a private meeting between collaborators. Elena looked at him for a long time. Hargrove knew Adrian's response. Hargrove knew your husband very well, not personally, professionally. He had been studying the organization for years. He knew Adrian Voss does not tolerate betrayal. He knew Adrian Voss would see that photograph and close the door. Webb's voice was flat. Not apologetic flat, which was worse. He needed you out of the estate. You had found the Ariston connection. He didn't know how much you had, but he knew you were looking. And he knew if you got the documents to your husband, before he'd completed the Sarant acquisition phase, the whole structure fell apart. Elena was quiet for a moment. He had my family destroyed, she said. Webb stopped. Years ago, she said, before I met Adrian. My father's business. The collapse, we always thought it was market conditions. Timing. Bad luck. She looked at Webb with an expression that was not anger yet. That was the thing that comes before anger when the anger is going to be the serious kind. The Marlowe Group collapsed in 2008. My father lost everything and died of a heart attack 2 years later. Was that Hargrove? Webb's face did something complicated and then went still. Yes, he said. The room went the specific quiet of a place where something has just changed permanently. The Marlowe Group had Harbor District interests, Webb said. His voice was careful now, in the way of a man navigating around something he understands could detonate. It was competing with the early Sarant positioning. Hargrove needed it gone. He used the financial crisis as cover a few key interventions in the credit line, some pressure on the primary lender, and the timing did the rest. He paused. I didn't know this until 8 months ago. When I found the file, that was when he stopped. Started what? Started making the property outside Merritt's Hollow clean, he said quietly. Because I understood then that I was not going to be able to stay in this position. Elena pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table. She was looking at a point somewhere between the table's surface and the middle distance, the look of someone whose internal framework has just been handed a piece that reorders the entire picture. Her father, her childhood, the specific shape of her adult life, the precariousness that had pushed her toward a powerful man, the particular vulnerability she had carried into that marriage without fully understanding its origin. All of it traceable now to a decision made in an office by a federal coordinator with a portfolio and a long view and no apparent capacity for understanding what the pieces he moved on a board actually cost in human terms. She heard her phone ring. Adrian's number. She picked it up. We're 4 minutes out, he said. Are you all right? I need you to hear something when you get here, she said. Something that's going to be hard. A pause. Tell me. Not on the phone. You need to hear it in person. She looked at Webb, who was watching her with the expression of a man who has already confessed and is now waiting for sentencing. There's more to this than Hargrove and the organization. There's something about your father, and there's something about mine. The silence on the line had a quality to it that she recognized from 2 years of marriage, the silence of Adrian Voss receiving information that has struck somewhere real and is being rapidly surrounded by the control that keeps it from showing. I'm 4 minutes out, he said again, and his voice was the same as before, except that it wasn't. She kept the phone at her ear until she heard tires on gravel. Adrian came through the door of the farmhouse the way he came through most doors, when the situation was operational fast, reading the room before he was fully inside it, taking in the layout, exits. The positions of the people in it, all of it, in under 2 seconds. Then his eyes found Elena, and he stopped. She was sitting at the kitchen table. She had both hands flat on the surface. She looked like she hadn't slept in 30 hours, which was probably accurate, and she was 8 months pregnant and had just outrun 2 men in a dark sedan on a gravel road. And she looked at him, when he came through the door, with an expression he couldn't quite name, not relief exactly, and not anger, and not the particular careful distance she had used in the study 6 months ago, when she was still deciding whether the truth was worth the cost. She just looked at him, like he was a fact she was still working out how to live with. Victor came in behind Adrian and stopped near the door. Webb, across the kitchen, straightened slightly. Give me the room, Adrian said without looking away from Elena. Victor and Webb went outside without discussion. The door closed. Adrian crossed to the table and sat in the chair across from Elena, not next to her, not standing over her, across from her, the way they had sat across from each other in the tree 6 months ago, except that this time he was the one who had called the meeting, and she was the one who had survived the night. Tell me, he said. She told him. She told him the whole of it, not from the beginning, not from the Farwell Street room, but from the thing that mattered most, Hargrove's involvement in the Marlowe Group collapse. Her father, the Harbor District, the way her entire life had been shaped by a decision someone made to remove a competitor. She watched Adrian's face while she talked. He was very still. The stillness he used when he was taking in something that required complete attention, not composure for the sake of composure, but the stillness of a person who understands that the wrong response right now will cost something he can't afford to lose. Then she told him about Rowan Voss. She told him about Ariston Group, about the authentication seal, about the succession mechanism in the original incorporation documents that had transferred control of the underlying structure to Hargrove after Rowan Voss's death, not by inheritance, not by legal designation to Adrian, but through a private clause that Rowan Voss had apparently inserted himself, designating a partner rather than a son as the successor controller of the instrument. Your father didn't leave the empire to you, she said. Not gently, she didn't have the energy for gentleness, and she had the sense that gentleness was not what Adrian needed. He left you the organization, but the foundation it was built on, the Ariston structure, the harbor positioning, the financial architecture that made everything else possible, he left that to Hargrove. By design, through a private legal mechanism that nobody ever looked at because nobody knew it existed. Adrian's face had gone through several things while she was talking. She had watched them move through it and disappear, each one suppressed before it could fully arrive, and what was left now was a stillness that was different from the earlier stillness controlled, but emptied. The face of a man whose internal framework has just been handed a piece that doesn't fit, and has now understood that the framework itself was the problem. He knew Hargrove, Adrian said. His voice was quiet, not raw past raw, into something flatter and more permanent. My father. They built it together. Ariston Group was a joint instrument. Equal partners, 1,987. She kept her voice level. I don't know what their arrangement was. I don't know if your father knew what Hargrove would do with the succession clause. I don't know if he was complicit in what came after, or if Hargrove moved independently once he had control. She paused. I don't have enough to tell you who your father was. I only have enough to tell you what he built. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. He put his hand on the table. Not reaching for her, just placing it there, flat on the surface, the way she had her hands. Like he needed something solid under his palm. My father, he said slowly, to the table, ordered the structure that destroyed your family. I don't know if he ordered it. I know the structure he built, enabled it. It's the same thing. She didn't argue. It was the same thing. He sat with that for a moment. She watched the muscles in his jaw work. Watched his hand press harder against the table. The person I sent you away to protect my organization from, he said, was the person trying to expose what my organization was protecting. He said it without inflection. Forensic. The voice of a man doing autopsies on himself. You were right about all of it. And I sent you into the road in the rain in the middle of the night. Adrian, I need a minute. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. Not an apology, something more basic than an apology. Something that hadn't yet made it to the level of language. She gave him the minute. Outside, she could hear Victor's voice, low and even, and Webb's occasional response. The space heater in the main room made its low cycling sound. The thin rain that had been threatening all day had arrived at last, hitting the farmhouse roof with the same needling insistence it had been practicing since the night before. When Adrian looked up, something had shifted in his face. Not resolved, it was not the kind of thing that could resolve in a minute, or in a month, or possibly in several years. Paralysis was gone. In its place was something she recognized from the first year of their marriage, before the organization had fully occupied him, before the weight of it had flattened out his range, a specific, slightly reckless quality of a man who has decided that the thing in front of him is the only thing that matters, and everything else is secondary. The files Webb pulled from the archive, he said. Do they include the Ariston Incorporation documents? He said he pulled everything connected to the Sarant Capital structure, which would include the succession clause. Yes. And your documents, the Trent materials, the cross-references, the financial diagrams. You still have all of it. She touched the bag at her side. Everything. Adrian nodded. Once deliberate, then we have enough. He looked at her. Not to win in court, not yet. But enough to make Hargrove understand that moving against us now makes everything visible, which is the one outcome he cannot afford. He paused. He's been operating in the gap between what's documented and what's provable. We close that gap. We change the math. He has federal resources. He has federal cover. That's different. Federal cover works when the operation stays invisible. Adrian's voice had taken on the quality she associated with him at his most functional, not cold, but stripped of everything that wasn't useful. We take the Ariston documents to the right people. Not the task force above the task force. The oversight mechanism that Hargrove can't reach because he built his story in the other direction. He looked at her steadily. Victor knows who. This is not going to be clean, Elena said. No, your organization is going to take exposure. The legitimate holding, some of them. Yes. He held her gaze. I know what I built, and I know what parts of it I'm going to have to open up to get through this. I've known that since you called this morning. A pause. I should have known it a long time ago. She looked at him. at the hand still flat on the table, at the exhaustion that had accumulated behind his eyes over 6 months of choosing the wrong story. "Baby," she said, not quite a question, "I know." His voice dropped. "I know. We're not going back to the estate. I know that, too." Outside a car door, Victor's voice rising briefly, then settling. The rain intensifying against the roof. Committed now, the thin performance of the morning turning into the real thing. Elena picked up the waterproof folder from the bag and placed it on the table between them. "Then let's figure out what we have," she said. Adrian reached for the folder. His hand was not shaking anymore. But before he could open it, his phone rang Victor from outside, and the quality of the ring was wrong. The pattern Victor used when something had changed rapidly, and the change was not in their favor. Adrian answered it. "Hargrove is at the Blackridge estate," Victor said. "He arrived 8 minutes ago with 4 men and a federal warrant. He's not there for the documents, Adrian. He already knows the documents are gone." A pause, very short. "He's there for the leverage." Adrian went still. "He's pulling the estate's financial registration," Victor continued. "The primary property title, the organizational charter documents, the asset records. He's building a seizure package." Another pause. "If he completes the filing before we get the Ariston materials to oversight, the estate goes into federal hold, and everything inside it becomes inaccessible, including the physical evidence we haven't pulled yet." Adrian looked at Elena. Elena looked back at him. "How long?" Adrian said. 2 hours. Maybe less. 2 hours to cross the distance between a farmhouse outside Merritt's Hollow and a city where a federal coordinator was methodically dismantling the last structure Adrian had left to stand on, using a warrant that had been built on the back of an investigation that had never been what it claimed to be, using a legal instrument that could only be challenged by documents that were currently sitting in a waterproof folder on a kitchen table, in a house that didn't exist in any record. Adrian stood up. "Get the car," he said into the phone, already moving. Elena was already on her feet. They took 2 cars. Victor drove the first with Webb in the passenger seat, Webb's archive files in a locked case in the trunk, Victor's phone running a live feed from a contact inside the city who was watching the Blackridge estate from a service vehicle parked on the adjacent street. Adrian drove the second with Elena, and he drove it the way he drove everything when the situation had reached the stage where caution was a liability fast. Deliberate, reading the road 3 moves ahead, not speaking unless there was something that needed to be said. Elena had the waterproof folder open on her lap. She was not reviewing the documents, she had memorized them weeks ago. She was reorganizing them into a sequence that matched the argument, ordering the physical evidence the way a lawyer orders a brief, working with a pen she had pulled from the bag, to annotate the corners with reference numbers that corresponded to a key she was building in the notebook beside her. Her hands were steady. That was the thing Adrian noticed in his peripheral vision every time he checked her hands, working on the documents, completely steady. His own hands on the wheel were not shaking, but they wanted to, and the wanting was a thing he was managing through the physical pressure of his grip, the specific effort of keeping his hands exactly where they were and not letting them show what his chest was doing. "Session clause," Elena said without looking up. "Webb's copy, does it have the original notarization, or is it a photocopy?" He said originals. Everything from the sub-level archive was physical. "Then it's admissible as primary documentation if we get it to the right hands before Hargrove files the seizure package." She made a note. "The chain of custody is going to be questioned. Webb pulled the files at 2:47 this morning under his own credential. They'll argue unauthorized removal. Webb's cooperation changes the framing. Whistleblower provisions apply if the exposure is of federal misconduct, which it is." She turned a page, which is exactly why Hargrove is moving on the estate now instead of waiting. He needs the physical assets under federal hold before the whistleblower framing can be established, because once it is, any evidence Webb removed becomes protected disclosure rather than theft. She paused. "He's not stupid, no, he's been doing this for 20 years. She closed the folder, held it flat against her thighs with both hands. "Adrian. Who is Victor calling? A federal oversight contact. Someone above the task force administrative level. Not a friend, a person who owes Victor a professional debt and who has his own reasons to want Hargrove's operation examined." Adrian kept his eyes on the road. "It's not clean. Nothing about this is clean. But it doesn't have to be clean. It has to be faster than Hargrove's filing timeline. Elena looked at the road ahead. The city was visible now, the skyline coming up through the rain, gray and close, the kind of day that made the buildings look like they were leaning together for warmth. And if we can't get to the estate before he completes the filing, she said, then we contest the seizure from the outside with the documents we have. It takes longer, it costs more, and it gives Hargrove time to build additional cover. He paused. But it's not over. It's just worse. You've thought this through. I thought it through in the car between Merritt's Hollow and the truck stop where I should have been 40 minutes ago. He glanced at her, brief, deliberate. I had a lot of time to think while you were running on a gravel road. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. Precursor to one, arriving and then setting aside for later. Drive faster, she said. He drove faster. Victor's contact called back 11 minutes outside the city. Victor put it on speaker immediately and held the phone between himself and Webb without ceremony, because there was no time for ceremony. The contact's name was Reeves. He had a title that involved the word inspector and a division that operated above the task force level, and he spoke in the rapid, slightly impatient cadence of a man who has been interrupted mid-morning by information that is simultaneously inconvenient and exactly the kind of thing he had been positioned to receive. What you're describing, Reeves said, is a coordinator running a parallel private operation using federal investigative cover. That's not a small thing. We know what it is, Victor said. You're going to need the Ariston Incorporation documents. Session clause specifically. And you're going to need a documented chain connecting the Sarant capital structure to active federal resources. We have both. I need them in my hands before Hargrove's filing clears the district court intake. Once it clears intake, it goes into the federal property system, and I can challenge it, but I can't stop it. A pause. How far out are you? 9 minutes. I'm already moving. There's a parking structure on the east side of Callaway Street, 2 blocks from the estate. Ground level, north corner. I'll have someone there. Another pause, shorter. Voss. If this document package is what you're saying it is, Hargrove is going to know the moment I start moving on it. He's going to accelerate, I know. Which means you need to keep him occupied at the estate long enough for me to get the filing challenged. Victor looked at the road, looked at Webb. Webb was looking straight ahead, with the expression of a man who has already done his accounting and is now simply waiting for the total. We'll handle the estate, Victor said. The call ended. Webb turned to look at Victor. How exactly are we handling the estate? Adrian handles the estate, Victor said. We get the documents to Reeves. He checked the mirror. Adrian's car 2 lengths behind was keeping pace. It's the only division of the problem that makes sense. Adrian walks into that building, and Hargrove has to deal with him directly. Hargrove can't ignore him. He's the registered owner. He has standing on the property, and confronting him personally is a different kind of exposure than filing paperwork against an empty building. He's going to go in there with no documentation and no legal standing and stall a federal coordinator. He's going to go in there and be Adrian Voss, Victor said, which has historically been sufficient. Webb looked at the road for a moment, and his wife. She goes with us. She does not go into that building. She's not going to agree to that. Victor's jaw set. No, he said, she's probably not. They pulled over 2 blocks from the estate to split the approach, and Elena was already talking before Adrian had the car in park. I'm not going with Victor, Elena. The documents need to go with Victor to Reeves. I agree with that. I'm not arguing about the documents. She turned in the seat to face him, the folder already transferred to Victor's keeping through the window, her hands now free and her attention completely undivided. But I'm not sitting in a parking structure while you walk into that building alone. I'm not walking in alone. You'll have no one. Victor's going to Reeves. Webb goes with Victor because Reeves needs Webb's testimony to establish the whistleblower framing. She held his eyes. You walk into that building, and Hargrove has 4 men and a federal warrant, and you have your name on the deed. That's what you have. It's enough to make him slow down. It's enough to get you detained if he decides the math works in his favor. Her voice was controlled, but there was something working very hard under the control. Something that had been working hard since the motel parking lot and had not been given permission to stop. I have been the person with the documents and the knowledge and the evidence for 6 months. I have been the person who built the case. I am 8 months pregnant, and I ran on a gravel road this morning, and I am not asking you to protect me. I am telling you that I am more useful in that building than in a parking structure." Adrian looked at her. He thought about saying no. He had the words for it, the operational argument, the risk calculus, the specific and legitimate fear that lived in his chest and had been living there since she said the sedan's door just opened in a voice that was trying very hard to stay flat. He had all of it available. He looked at her face, at the set of her jaw, at the particular quality in her eyes that he had seen in the study 6 months ago when she had placed her hands at her waist and tried to make him understand something he had decided not to hear. He had not listened then. "Stay behind me," he said. "Whatever happens in there, you stay behind me and you let me lead the conversation. If I tell you to leave the room, you leave the room." She held his gaze for a moment, then agreed. They got out of the car. There were 2 of Hargrove's men at the estate's front entrance, not uniformed, but carrying the posture and the specific kind of deliberate visibility that federal operatives used when they wanted to establish presence without technically constituting an obstruction. They clocked Adrian from 30 feet away and exchanged a look that they thought was invisible. Adrian walked straight at them without adjusting his pace. "This is private property," he said, not loudly, not aggressively. The voice of a man stating a fact in his own home. "Your warrant covers a document search. It does not cover physical access restriction. Move." The taller one stepped slightly forward. "Voss, Coordinator Hargrove, Is Coordinator Hargrove the owner of this property?" Pause. "No, sir, but the federal warrant covers document retrieval, which I'm aware of. I've read the statute." He stopped 3 feet from them. Close enough that the interaction became personal rather than procedural. "You're standing on my front step without authority to prevent my entry. Move, or I call my attorney and the next 15 minutes become very complicated for both of you." They moved. Elena went through the door behind him. She felt the taller man's eyes on her, not threatening, calculating. Noting her presence, logging it, probably already reaching for a radio. The estate's front hall was wrong. Not visually, it looked exactly as it always had. The same floors, the same light from the east windows, the same faint smell of old wood, and the cleaning solution Marcus Webb had always insisted on for the baseboards. But there were 2 more men in the hall, positioned at the study door and the corridor to the administrative wing, and the sounds coming from the administrative wing were the sounds of systematic searching drawers, files, the deliberate, unhurried efficiency of people who have done this before. Hargrove was in the study. Adrian knew it before he reached the door. The same way you know certain things about a building you've lived in long enough, from the weight of the silence in that particular room relative to the activity everywhere else, from the stillness at the center of a moving operation. He opened the study door. Hargrove was 61 years old and looked it in the way that certain kinds of work makes you look it, not broken down but compressed, like something that had been under continuous pressure long enough to develop the specific density of a thing that will not give way easily. He was at Adrian's desk, not sitting in Adrian's chair, standing beside it, looking at a document that one of his people had laid open on the surface. And he looked up when Adrian came through the door, with the expression of a man who is not surprised and has decided that not being surprised is itself a form of power. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I was wondering when you'd arrive." "Get away from my desk," Adrian said. Hargrove didn't move immediately. He held the eye contact for a beat that was slightly too long, establishing the question of who was going to set the pace of this encounter, and then he stepped away from the desk, not because Adrian had told him to, his posture said, but because he had decided that the desk was no longer interesting. He saw Elena. Something moved across his face, rapid, controlled, but real. Surprise, and under the surprise, a recalibration. He had not expected her here. He had expected the documents to be in transit, and the woman who carried them to be managed separately, and the fact that she was standing in this room meant that at least one of his moving pieces had landed somewhere other than where he'd put it. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Marlowe," Elena said. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. "Of course. You knew my father," she said. She said it the way she said things she had decided to say directly, without preamble, without the softening that invites a denial. "The Marlowe Group. 2008. A pause. "I was aware of the Marlowe Group's difficulties. Yes. You caused them. That's a significant claim. I have documentation. She held his gaze. I have documentation of a great many things. Coordinator. Which I suspect you already know, since you've spent the last 2 hours trying to put everything in this building into a federal hold before I could get back. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. The man at the study door shifted his weight slightly, the way people do when the air in a room changes and their body registers it before their mind does. The warrant is legally issued, Hargrove said. Whatever you believe about my motivations, the legal instrument is sound. The legal instrument is built on an investigation that you constructed, Adrian said, using your access to federal resources, with the explicit purpose of destabilizing this organization so that a private holding structure you've controlled since 1994 could absorb the assets. He walked to the center of the room. Not toward Hargrove, to the center, the way you walk to the middle of a space to establish that the space is yours. Ariston Group, Rowan Voss's seal, a succession clause that transferred control to you on my father's death. He watched Hargrove's face. I know what my father built. I know what you did with it after he was gone. And I know what you did to get to this point. Hargrove's face was still, very carefully still. The stillness of a man who is running a complex calculation behind an expression he is holding fixed through professional habit. You don't have the Ariston documents, Hargrove said. Flat. Testing. Why would you think that? Because they were in the sublevel archive and Marcus Webb brought them to me, Adrian said. Yes. The calculation behind Hargrove's eyes shifted. Adrian watched it shift, watched the man understand that Webb had not gone where Hargrove had positioned him to go, that the piece he had relied on to manage the document exposure had instead moved in the opposite direction. He watched Hargrove process this and arrive at the operational conclusion, which was that the document package was no longer inside this building, which meant the seizure filing was no longer sufficient, which meant he needed to change the approach. He watched Hargrove decide to escalate. Take them, Hargrove said to the man at the door. Not loudly. Just said it, the way you say a thing you've already decided. Adrian was moving before the words were finished. Not toward Hargrove. Toward Elena, which was the only direction that mattered. Because the man at the door was already crossing the room, and he was the nearest vector, and he was bigger than Elena, and she was 8 months pregnant, and none of the rest of it was relevant until she was behind something solid. He got to her before the man did. Put himself between them, his back to Elena, facing the approaching man, and he said nothing. He just looked at him with the full weight of 20 years, of being the most dangerous person in most rooms. Looked at him with everything that was under the control, and the composure let it come up to the surface just enough to be visible, and the man slowed. Not stopped, slowed. Don't, Adrian said, very quiet. The man looked at Hargrove. She has information material to a federal investigation, Hargrove said. Still controlled. Still using the legal language like a scaffold. You have standing to search documents, Adrian said. You have no standing to detain a private citizen who has committed no crime. If you touch her, I will have your warrant invalidated on civil rights grounds before your filing clears intake, and everything you've built for 14 months comes down on procedural violation. He held the man's eyes. Back up. A long moment. The kind that has physical mass, that takes up the space between two people and makes the air difficult. The man backed up. Hargrove's jaw tightened. The first visible crack in the composure, not anger, frustration, the particular frustration of a careful plan encountering a variable that shouldn't exist. You're stalling, Hargrove said. Yes, Adrian said. The filing will clear intake in less time than it already did 5 minutes ago, Adrian said. Because someone has been working on that problem since before we walked in this door. Hargrove looked at him. Something changed in his face, a deepening. The calculation going to a level that hadn't been engaged yet, reassessing the entire encounter from the beginning. And in the reassessment, something that might have been, in a different man, the beginning of something like respect. Reeves, Hargrove said quietly. Not a question. You've had a long run, Adrian said. 20 years is a long run. But you built it on something that was never as solid as you believed, and you kept it standing by being the person who controlled what got examined. Examination has changed. He paused. It's over. Nothing is over, Hargrove said, until his phone rang. He looked at it. Something happened in his face, something that passed through too fast to name. A flash of something genuine under all the composed professionalism, and then it was gone. He answered it. He listened for approximately 12 seconds. Then he lowered the phone. The room was very quiet. The man at the window had turned to look at Hargrove. The man who had backed up was still near the door, watching. Adrian could feel Elena behind him, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel the slight warmth of her, could hear her breathing, could feel the controlled quality of it the way you feel a hand pressed flat against a wall in the dark. The filing is suspended, Hargrove said. To the room, to no one specifically, to the fact of it. Pending an oversight review. His voice was the same as before, controlled, professional, but something underneath it had changed. The infrastructure the voice had been sitting on had shifted, and it was audible if you knew what you were listening for. Adrian said nothing. Hargrove looked at him. For a long moment, the two of them stood in the study of the Blackridge estate, the man who had inherited what his father built, and the man who had spent 20 years positioning himself to take it, and looked at each other across the space of everything that had happened and everything that was now going to follow. You'll have to open the books, Hargrove said. Whatever else happens. Oversight doesn't stop at me. They'll look at the whole structure. I know. Parts of what you've built aren't clean. I know that, too. And I'm willing to do what's necessary to make this right, Adrian said. That's a different calculation than the one you made 20 years ago. You decided that what could be concealed was the same as what didn't exist. I'm not going to make that decision. Hargrove looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at Elena, who had moved from behind Adrian and was standing at his side, and he looked at her with an expression that was complicated, in a way that seemed almost involuntary, not remorse exactly, but its structural relative. The thing that lives next to remorse in a person who has operated at distance from consequences for long enough that consequences have taken on an abstract quality. The Marlowe group, he said to her, quiet, almost private. Yes, Elena said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away. Get your people out of this building, Adrian said. His voice was even. Not triumphant. There was nothing in this room to be triumphant about, and he understood that. Now, Hargrove turned to his men. He said something short and low, and they began to move, gathering materials, pulling equipment from the administrative wing, the sounds of the systematic searching, reversing into the sounds of systematic withdrawal. Hargrove went last. At the study door he paused. He didn't turn around. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his back to the room, and then he said, to the doorframe, Your father wasn't a bad man. A pause. He was a man who wanted to build something permanent, and didn't understand that the person he trusted to help him build it had a longer view than he did. Another pause. For what that's worth. He walked out. The sound of the front door closing, several minutes later, was the sound of a chapter ending not cleanly, not completely, but definitely. The way chapters end in actual life, rather than in the stories people tell about actual life, not with silence, but with the continuation of ordinary sounds, the rain on the east windows, the settling of the old house, the faint noise of vehicles leaving the drive. Adrian stood in the center of his study with his hands at his sides. Elena stood next to him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Elena sat down, not carefully, not deliberately, but abruptly, the way the body sometimes insists on sitting when it has been pushed past its reasonable operating limit, in the chair across from the desk that had been her chair for 6 months of marriage, and then not her chair for 6 months of everything else. She pressed both hands flat against her stomach and breathed. Adrian crossed to her. He crouched down in front of the chair, not kneeling, crouching, at her level, close enough that she didn't have to look far to find him. Put one hand over hers. She looked at him. Her eyes this close showed what the rest of her face had been managing for hours, not fear, the aftermath of fear, the specific exhaustion that comes from running on adrenaline past the point where the body consents to it. Okay, she said, not to him specifically. To the fact of the room, the house, the moment. Yeah, he said, his phone buzzed. Victor Reeves has the package. Filing suspended. We need to talk about next steps, but not tonight. Adrian looked at the message. Then he put the phone in his pocket. Victor, he said, I heard she had. She had very good hearing and he was close. Not tonight, no. She closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then opened them. The baby, she said. I should call the doctor. She stopped. Looked at the ceiling briefly. I've been on a gravel road and in a truck and driving for 4 hours and running on nothing, and I should call the doctor. Yes, he was already reaching for his phone. Give me the number, she told him. He dialed. He handed her the phone when it connected and stayed where he was, crouched in front of her chair, while she spoke to the doctor's service in the controlled, informative voice she used when she needed to communicate a medical situation without communicating the panic that would slow the communication down. When she handed the phone back, the doctor's service had told her to come in immediately. Adrian stood up. He held out his hand. She looked at it. At his face. At the hand. She took it. He helped her up from the chair and didn't let go, and she didn't take her hand back. And they walked out of the study together into the hall of the Blackridge estate, the house that had been built on the edge of a crater neither of them had known was there. The house where 6 months ago she had walked out into the rain, and he had stood at the open door and chosen the wrong thing. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. But the people walking through it were not the same people who had stood in the study the night she left. And the ground under the house was not the same ground it had been before she came back with a waterproof folder, and the patience to survive being right when the wrong answer was so much easier. Outside, the rain had stopped, not gradually, the way rain usually stops abruptly, mid-motion, as if it had accomplished the thing it came to do and had no reason to continue. Adrian opened the passenger door of the car. Elena got in. He walked around to the driver's side, and the wet gravel of the drive sounded different under his feet than it had 20 minutes ago. Or perhaps it sounded exactly the same, and he was hearing it differently, which is not the same thing, but is sometimes the closest you can get to one. He got in the car. He started the engine. Adrian, Elena said as he put the car in gear. He looked at her. After the doctor, she said, "We're going to need to talk about all of it. Father, my father. What gets opened, what gets closed, what we do with the organization from here." She paused. "All of it. I know. I'm not going to make it easy." "I know that too." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she faced forward. He pulled out of the drive, and the Blackridge estate receded behind them. In the wet dark of the early evening, and somewhere ahead of them was a doctor's office, and a conversation they had both been building toward for months, and the specific, unresolved, complicated future of two people who had survived something together without yet knowing what surviving it was going to mean for who they were to each other now. The road was empty in both directions. Adrian drove, and Elena sat beside him with her hands in her lap. And the silence between them was not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of things that were going to require more than a car ride, and more than one conversation, and more than the relief of the immediate crisis being past, and both of them knew it, and neither of them looked away from the road. Behind them, in the study of the Blackridge estate, the music box sat on the third shelf of the bookcase, exactly where Elena had placed it 6 months ago, the compartment in the base empty now, the ring no longer inside it. The ring was on a chain around Elena's neck, where it had been since the 3rd month in the Farwell Street room, when she had taken it out of the notebook pocket where she'd been keeping it and put it somewhere closer. Not as a symbol of anything, not as a statement about the marriage, or the man, or the choice she had made, or the choice she was still in the process of making. Just because it was hers, and she had learned, in 6 months of carrying everything alone, that the things that were hers were worth keeping close. The doctor's name was Pearson, and she had been Elena's physician for 2 years before the Farwell Street room. And she did not ask questions about the 6-month gap in appointments, or about the man sitting in the waiting room chair, with his elbows on his knees, and his hands pressed together in front of his mouth like he was holding something in place. She asked Elena how she felt. Elena said she felt like she had been running on fumes for 6 months and had spent the morning being chased across a gravel road. Dr. Pearson looked at her over the top of her clipboard and said, "Let's be more specific." And Elena, for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, almost laughed. The examination took 40 minutes. The baby was fine, positioned correctly, heartbeat steady, measuring exactly where it should measure for 34 weeks. Dr. Pearson said the word remarkable with a quality that suggested she meant it as a medical observation and not a compliment, and prescribed rest, hydration, and the cessation of whatever activity had produced the bruise on Elena's left shoulder from the connecting room door she'd broken through that morning. Elena did not explain the bruise. She dressed, gathered her bag, and went out to the waiting room. Adrian looked up when she came through the door. He had been sitting in the same position since she'd gone in, or close enough to it that the difference wasn't visible, and when he saw her face, the specific quality her face had taken on. Not relief, but the closest available approximation, he stood up and let out a breath that seemed to have been waiting some time for release. "Both fine," she said. He nodded. His jaw moved once, the way it did when he was absorbing something that had a physical dimension as well as an informational one. Then he held the outer door open, and she walked through it, and they went to the car without speaking, and the silence was not uncomfortable, exactly. But it was loaded in the way that a silence is loaded, when two people are both aware of the conversation that has to happen, and are each waiting for the right angle of entry. He drove to a hotel, not the estate. Neither of them suggested the estate. He booked 2 rooms, and she looked at him when he said 2, and he said, "You don't have to share a room with me. That's not a condition of anything." And she said, "1 room," in the voice she used for things she had decided and was not interested in revisiting. He booked 1 room. The room was on the 8th floor, with a window that faced east, and the city was visible below in the particular way. Cities are visible at night from height reduced, ordered, chaos of it transformed by distance into something that looks almost like a plan. Elena sat in the chair by the window with her shoes off and a glass of water on the table beside her, and Adrian sat on the edge of the bed opposite her. And they looked at each other across the space of the room, and the space of 6 months, and the space of everything that had happened in both. "Tell me about your father," Elena said, not gently, not harshly either, the voice she used for necessary things. Adrian looked at the floor for a moment, then at her. "He was a hard man," he said. "Not cruel. Not the way people think when they hear the word hard. He was precise. He had a very specific picture of what the world should look like, and he worked toward it constantly, and the things that didn't fit the picture he simply didn't acknowledge." He paused. "I thought that was strength when I was young. I built my entire idea of strength around it. When did you stop thinking that?" "I didn't. Not completely. Not until today." He said it without self-pity, flatly, as an observation about the distance between where he'd been and where he now was. "I knew my father made arrangements I didn't know about. I knew there were layers to what he'd built that I hadn't been shown. I told myself it was the nature of the work, the need for compartmentalization, the standard architecture of keeping the most sensitive pieces separate from the people who might inadvertently compromise them." A pause. "I told myself a lot of things. Hargrove said he wasn't a bad man. Hargrove spent 20 years using my father's name and my father's seal and my father's architecture to build a private empire. Hargrove's assessment of my father's character is not something I'm prepared to weight heavily." He looked at her. "But I also can't tell you he was wrong. I don't know what my father knew about what Hargrove would do. I know what the documents show. I know there's a succession clause that gave Hargrove control of the heiress structure on my father's death. I don't know if my father inserted that clause knowing what Hargrove intended, or if Hargrove convinced him it was a standard legal precaution, or if my father trusted someone he shouldn't have for reasons that seemed sound at the time." He held her gaze. "That's the honest answer. I don't know." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "My father trusted someone he shouldn't have," she said. "The result was the same." "Yes, I'm not drawing an equivalence. I know they're not equivalent. Hargrove destroyed my father's business, and my father died of a heart attack 2 years later, and your father built the structure that enabled it." She was precise about this, careful, the way she was careful about things she had spent time thinking through. "I'm saying that both of them were men who couldn't see the thing they were trusting clearly, and both of them paid for it, and we're the ones who are still here dealing with what that cost." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "I spent 20 years making your father's mistake look like a strategy," he said. She held his eyes. "And I chose the version of every situation that required less of me. The version that let me stay inside my certainty." He paused. "I chose it the night you came to my study with the documents. I chose it because believing you required me to accept that Victor might be innocent and that you had spent a week trying to protect me at risk to yourself, and that was a more complicated picture than the one I had, and I didn't want a more complicated picture. You chose it," Elena said, "and I walked out into the rain. And I spent 6 months in a room above a dry cleaning shop, building the case that you should have built with me." She said it without heat, with the precision of someone who's been carrying a fact for a long time and has finally found the moment to set it down where it can be looked at directly. I need you to understand that, not abstractly, specifically. You made a choice, and the consequence of that choice was a woman who is 8 months pregnant running on a gravel road from men who were trying to recover the evidence she'd been keeping alone. I understand, say it, she said. Not as an acknowledgement. As a fact, he looked at her. His hands, on his knees, pressed down slightly, the gesture she had learned to read as him doing the internal work, the thing under the composure being confronted rather than managed. I chose the easier story over the true one, he said. And you carried the consequence of that choice alone. For 6 months, while you were pregnant with our child. His voice was even, but the effort of keeping it even was visible in the way his jaw set between sentences. Can't undo that. I know I can't undo it. But I need you to know that I understand exactly what I did, and that I understand it at the level of not strategy, not error. What I did to you, as a person, not a variable in the organization. The room was quiet. Outside, the city continued its ordinary business, indifferent and continuous. Elena looked at him for a long time. She was reading something in his face, the way she read documents, not quickly, not impressionistically, but thoroughly, checking each element against what she knew. Then she said, I put the ring on a chain. He looked at the chain at her collarbone, at the small shape beneath her shirt where the ring rested against her sternum. I know, he said, I didn't put it back on my finger. I know that too. I don't know yet what I'm doing with it. With any of it. She touched the chain briefly, not pulling it out, just feeling it. I'm telling you so you don't mistake the chain for a decision. I won't. And I'm telling you that I came back. Not because you deserved it. Not because the organization needed the documents delivered. I came back because she stopped. Looked at the window. The city below. Because what we were supposed to be was worth trying to get back to. Even after everything. She looked at him again. That's not forgiveness. It's not absolution. It's just the truth of where I am. I'll take it, he said. Quiet. Without the calculation that sometimes lived under his quiet. She looked at him for another moment. Then she leaned her head back against the chair and closed her eyes. I need to sleep, she said. For approximately a week. Sleep, he said. He stayed where he was on the edge of the bed, not moving, not speaking, while her breathing evened out, and the city did its quiet work below the window, and the room settled into the specific stillness of a place where two people are occupying the same space for the first time after a long time apart, and neither of them is entirely sure yet what the rules are, but both of them have decided that the space is preferable to the alternative. The following weeks were not simple. They were not the aftermath that stories sometimes provide, the clean resolution, the visible mending, the transformation that arrives fully formed. They were the actual aftermath, which looked more like phone calls with lawyers that lasted 3 hours and ended inconclusively, and Victor sitting across a conference table, a federal oversight investigator named Reeves, with a stack of documents between them that represented 20 years of accumulated entanglement, and Elena at a separate table in a separate building, giving a 7-hour recorded testimony about the Ariston Group, the Sarant capital structure, Caruso Trent's role as an operational intermediary, and the specific chain of events that had led a woman in her 3rd trimester to break through a connecting room door in a roadside motel at 10 in the morning. Hargrove was placed on administrative suspension, pending the oversight investigation. He did not resign immediately. He held on for 11 days, making statements through his department's communications office about the integrity of the task force's work and the proper legal mechanisms for contesting any findings. On the 12th day, he submitted his resignation in a letter that was 2 sentences long and contained no acknowledgement of anything specific. The letter was published, and it meant nothing in the way that 2-sentence letters always mean nothing, but it meant something to Elena, who read it once at the kitchen table of the hotel suite they had moved into while the estate's administrative situation was resolved, and then set it down and made coffee, and did not mention it again. Marcus Webb's cooperation was formally recognized under federal whistleblower provisions. He faced a separate process for the access violations, the credential use, the document removal, and that process took several months and produced a result that was neither clean nor punitive, but landed somewhere in the middle ground where most human accountability actually lives. He lost his position. He kept his freedom. He spent a long time, afterward, Being a man who had done a bad thing and then done a harder thing, and learning to hold both of those facts at once without letting either one become the whole of the story. Elise Caron was contacted by the oversight team and gave testimony of her own about the administrative anomalies she had flagged before leaving the organization and the administrative pressure that had followed her flagging them. She was offered a consulting role with the oversight division. She took it and she was good at it, and that was the kind of outcome that doesn't resolve anything retroactively but matters anyway. The baby came on a Thursday. Not dramatically labor is almost never dramatic in the way that stories make it dramatic. It is instead relentless, which is its own kind of drama, the drama of something that does not stop until it is finished, that does not offer intervals for second thoughts or strategy adjustments, or the kind of controlled response that Adrian Voss had spent his entire adult life perfecting. He was in the room. He had asked, carefully, the week before, whether she wanted him there, and she had looked at him with the expression she used for questions, whose answers she considered self-evident and yes, obviously, and that had been the end of that particular conversation. He was not useful in the room. He understood that. He was present, which was a different thing, and which was what was required, and he was present in the way that mattered, not performing calm, not managing the situation, not looking for the angle that would give him some operational leverage over an experience that was fundamentally not operational. He held her hand when she wanted it held, and moved back when she needed the space, and didn't try to make it better with words, because there were no words for it, and he understood that about it. And unstained, and the understanding was something that had not been available to him 6 months ago. The baby was a girl. She arrived at 4:47 in the afternoon, when the light through the room's window was the specific color of late autumn, a low gold that has already done most of its work for the day and is settling toward done. She weighed 7 pounds and 3 ounces, and she looked, in the first minutes, like an opinion fierce and specific and entirely her own, which Adrian noticed, and which made something happen in his chest that he had no word for and didn't try to find one. Elena held her and looked at her in the way that people look at things they have been carrying for a long time when they finally arrive in the world outside themselves, with a recognition that is also a kind of relief, the relief of the thing being real rather than only imagined. She has your jaw, Elena said. Adrian looked. He couldn't see it. Babies are their own argument against the idea that they look like anyone, but he said, she has your hands, which was true, or close enough to true that it felt like the right thing to say. And Elena looked at the small hands currently working against the air with the concentration of someone conducting a complex negotiation with gravity, and her face did something quiet and involuntary and real. Adrian sat in the chair at the side of the bed, close, but with the sense of distance that the moment itself required not his moment to be the center of, not his experience to name. He sat and he watched, and the room was quiet, in the way that rooms are quiet when something has just happened inside them that has no adequate register in ordinary sound. They did not go back to the Blackridge estate. The decision was not a single conversation. It was a series of smaller conversations over several weeks about the estate and what it represented, and the specific weight of a house that had been the site of a night neither of them could simply walk back inside and not feel. It was Adrian who said first that he thought they should sell it, and Elena, who was surprised enough by this to be silent for a moment, before she asked him if he was sure. He said he was. The estate sold to a property development group 6 months later. It went quickly and at a good price, and Adrian stood outside it, on the morning of the signing, with his hands in his pockets, and looked at the front door for a long time without going through it. Victor stood beside him. They had developed, over the months of the investigation and the aftermath, a different register in their relationship, the same fundamental trust, but more visible now, less taken for granted, the way things become visible when they've been tested and held. Victor didn't say anything while Adrian looked at the door. He had learned, over 11 years, the difference between silences that needed filling and silences that needed company. I keep thinking about the night she left, Adrian said finally, standing at that door while she walked out into the rain. I keep thinking that I could have said one word differently. One sentence. One question instead of a conclusion. You could have, Victor said. That's not helpful. You didn't ask me to be helpful. You said what you were thinking. Adrian looked at the door for another moment. No. I didn't ask you to be helpful. He turned away from it. Let's go. They walked back to the car, and the Blackridge estate receded behind them, for the last time, and Adrian did not look back, and the not looking back was a choice rather than an instinct, which is the kind of choice that costs something and is worth the cost. The investigation took 14 months to resolve. 14 months of depositions and document reviews, and the slow, unsatisfying machinery of institutional accountability working through this evidence that Elena had built in a room above a dry cleaning shop, cross-referencing records on a $40 laptop, 8 months pregnant and running on crackers, and the specific determination of a person who has decided that being right is not enough, that being right and being able to prove it, in a form that survives contact with the systems that would prefer a different conclusion, is the only version of right that matters. The Ariston Group documents established the foundation. The Sarant capital structure was dismantled by the Oversight Division over the course of 9 months. The Harbor District permits were reviewed, and several were revoked, and Daniel Cho resigned from his municipal position and entered a cooperation agreement. The law firm that had incorporated both the Sarant Shells and the Trent intermediary structures was investigated separately, and 2 partners were disbarred, which is a consequence that sounds small relative to the size of the thing they had participated in, and is small, but is the size of the actual consequence available, which is a fact about institutional accountability that Elena understood without needing it explained. Caruso Trent was indicted on conspiracy charges related to the Sarant operation. He had positioned himself as an intermediary rather than a principal, which was accurate enough legally to affect the severity of the charges, and he spent the subsequent years making arguments about his level of involvement that were probably true in their detail, and certainly cynical in their framing. Hargrove was indicted on 4 counts, including abuse of federal authority, obstruction, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The verdict came back on a Tuesday morning, and Elena was not in the courtroom. For it, she was at a park 2 miles away, sitting on a bench with the baby, who was 11 months old and currently engaged in a concentrated effort to fit a fallen leaf into her mouth. And Elena's phone buzzed with the message from Victor, and she read it and sat for a while, watching the baby work on the leaf. And the feeling that moved through her was not satisfaction, which she had expected, but something quieter and more like the end of a long-held breath. She put the phone in her pocket. She took the leaf gently away from the baby, who objected in the specific, full-throated way she had developed for having things removed, and Elena said, I know, and found a clean alternative from the bag that was not a leaf and therefore acceptable. She sat on the bench for another 20 minutes before she called Adrian. The house they moved into was in a town 40 minutes from the city, on a street with large trees and no gates and neighbors, who had no particular reason to know anything about them. It was old without being grand, the kind of house that had been lived in by several families before them, and showed it, in the particular way that houses show long occupation, scuffs on the baseboards. A kitchen that had been updated at least twice without quite achieving a unified vision. A garden in the back that had been ambitious at some point and had since arrived at a comfortable wildness. Elena liked the garden. She had not known this about herself before she had grown up in apartments, had lived in the estate's formalizenscaping for 4 years without ever touching it. But something about the combination of the baby and the aftermath, and the specific exhaustion of having been in motion for so long, produced in her a new appetite for things that were rooted. She spent hours in the garden in the first spring, not with any particular expertise, learning as she went, making the mistakes that you make when you start something without training, and deciding that the mistakes are part of it. Adrian learned to cook. This was not a small thing, and it did not happen easily. He had spent his entire adult life in environments where food was produced by other people and arrived ready, and the first several months of his attempts were the record of a man who is competent at most things he applies himself to, and is encountering, for perhaps the first time, something that resists competence as the primary tool. He burned things. He undersalted and then overcorrected. He produced a pasta dish that Elena ate 3 bites of, and then set down her fork, with an expression she was trying very hard to keep neutral. He saw the expression. It's bad. It's not, it's a texture issue. Elena, it's bad, she said, but you made it so. He looked at the pasta, then at her. Then he started laughing, which surprised both of them, a real laugh. The kind that comes up from somewhere below intention, the kind he had not produced in longer than he could precisely calculate. And Elena looked at him laughing over a failed pasta dish in the kitchen of a house without gates. And after a moment she was laughing too, and the baby, in the chair at the end of the table. At both of them, with the expression she used for adult behavior she found inexplicable and was reserving judgment on. They were not fixed. That is the honest accounting of where they were. A year after the hotel room and the two chairs and the conversation that had laid out the damage and the distance and the specific truth of where each of them actually stood. They were not fixed because people are not fixed. Because what had happened between them had happened and was not the kind of thing that repairs itself cleanly. There were sights when Elena lay awake, and the room above the dry cleaning shop felt closer than the bed she was currently in, when the specific aloneness of that time pressed against her in the dark, and the distance she had traveled to get back to this place felt very large and very recent, and Adrian sleeping beside her was both a comfort and a complicated thing. There were days when Adrian looked at his daughter and thought about the 8 months he had missed. Not missed as in been absent, but missed as in chosen against. Chosen a version of events that placed him at his desk, and Elena on a gravel road, and the thought sat in him like a stone that doesn't dissolve, that you learn to carry without letting it stop you from moving, but that you don't pretend isn't there. He'd begun meeting, twice a month, with a man named Sorel who was a therapist, and who had a dry, unhurried quality that Adrian had initially found irritating and had come to understand was intentional. He had not told many people about the meetings. He had told Elena, and Elena had said, "Good," in the voice she used for things she had been waiting for, and that had been that. The organization had been restructured significantly in the aftermath of the investigation. Several operations were closed, the ones that Reeves's team had flagged as operating in the gray areas that the oversight process had illuminated. Some of the legitimate holdings had been acquired by outside buyers at prices that were not what they would have been in better circumstances. What remained was smaller and cleaner and less profitable and more defensible, and Adrian had made each of those trades with a clarity he had not expected to feel. Victor stayed. He had built enough of his own reputation through the oversight process, the testimony, the document organization, the contact with Reeves, that he had options he hadn't had before, and he chose to stay, which Adrian understood was a choice and treated accordingly. On a morning in the second spring, Adrian was standing at the kitchen window with coffee when he saw Elena in the garden. She was crouching near the far edge, where the old rose bushes grew in a kind of organized chaos that she had been gradually negotiating with, and she had the baby beside her, sitting in the grass, which the baby had recently decided was an acceptable surface now that she could sit upright with confidence. Elena was showing her something, a small thing, held between her fingers, something from the garden floor, a pebble or a seed or a piece of bark, and the baby was looking at it with the absolute focused attention she brought to everything new, which was everything, which meant the attention was constant and complete, and watching it was something Adrian could not do without it doing something to him that he had given up trying to name. Elena looked up at some point and saw him at the window. She didn't wave, didn't smile. She just looked at him for a moment, the way she looked at things she was taking in fully, not managing or analyzing, just receiving. Then she looked back at the baby, who had decided the thing in Elena's fingers was worth taking personally and was reaching for it with both hands. Adrian finished his coffee. He put the mug in the sink. He went out the back door into the garden. The grass was wet from the previous night, not rain, just the morning damp that settles overnight and lifts slowly with the sun. His shoes were wrong for it, and he would have wet feet by the time he crossed the lawn, and he crossed it anyway. He crouched down beside Elena and the baby. The baby looked at him with the expression she used for his arrivals, a quick, assessing recognition, the way she had already begun to read the people in her immediate world as distinct and specific, each with their own pattern and their own meaning. He held out one finger. She took it in her whole hand. "Pebble," Elena said. She was still holding whatever she had found. She put it in his other hand. It was a pebble smooth gray, the size of a thumbnail. Ordinary in the way that things are ordinary when they have been shaped by a long time of small forces. He looked at it, then at Elena. She was not looking at him. She was watching the baby, who had shifted her grip from his finger to his sleeve, testing its texture with the thoroughness she applied to all investigations. "She's going to be stubborn," Elena said. "Yes, She gets it from both sides, so there's not much to be done about it. No. He closed his hand around the pebble. Elena. She looked at him. There were things he could have said. He had been building them, in various forms, for months, the version that was an apology, the version that was a promise, the version that tried to encompass all of it in a shape that could be spoken aloud and received whole. He had constructed them carefully, the way he constructed most things, and none of them, in the construction, had felt like enough. He looked at her in the wet morning grass of a garden they were learning together, with their daughter between them, holding his sleeve, and he said the only true thing that had no constructed version, "I'm not going to waste what you came back for." Elena held his gaze. She had the expression she used for things she was deciding how to hold, reading it, weighing it, not accepting it reflexively, but not dismissing it either. Then she looked back at the baby, and the expression shifted the considering quality, releasing into something quieter and more settled. "I know," she said. The baby released his sleeve and reached for the pebble, which she had apparently decided was the more interesting object all along, and Elena opened his hand gently and let the baby have it, watching to make sure it stayed in the hand and didn't become an investigation of a different kind. The sun was fully up now, the morning damp beginning to lift, the garden emerging from its overnight gray into its actual colors, the roses coming green, the old wood of the fence at the back, the yellow of a dandelion that had arrived without invitation, and that Elena had decided to leave on the basis that something that persistent deserved a chance. Adrian stayed crouched in the grass beside his family in the wet morning, with wet shoes and a pebble he'd just been relieved of, and no gate at the front of the house, and the particular, complicated, unfinished, continuing feeling of a man who has lost the thing he thought he was building, and found, in the losing of it, the thing he had actually needed to build. It was not a happy ending in the clean sense. It was not the restoration of what had been the estate, the uncomplicated certainty, the version of himself that had stood at an open door and watched a woman walk into the rain and believed that was a decision he could live inside without cost. That man was gone. What was left was this: wet shoes, a garden, a child with a pebble, and a woman who had survived the worst version of his judgment and come back not because the story demanded it, but because she had decided it was worth trying for. He would spend a long time, years probably, in the honest accounting earning the truth of that decision. He understood that. He was not under the impression that understanding it was the same as having done it. But he was in the garden, and the morning was real, and the baby was laughing now, at the pebble in her hand with the total, uncomplicated joy of someone encountering a thing for the first time, and that was where they were. It was enough to start from. It was in the end where everything actually starts, not in the resolution, not in the moment the crisis breaks, but in the ordinary morning after, when the choices that remain are smaller and quieter and more sustained than the ones that made the story. And the work is not surviving, but becoming, slowly and imperfectly, and without the clarity that catastrophe briefly provides, the person the people who stayed deserved to stand next to. The garden held them. The morning continued. The baby kept the pebble, and no one took it from her. And the day opened up ahead of all of them without edges, without the shape of a plan, just the ongoing fact of time, and the people moving through it together, which is the only ending that is ever, in the real and unedited sense, actually an ending.